Okay, good morning. Good morning. I am delighted to welcome everyone to the 19th Annual Dean's Diversity Forum. This forum was started 19 years ago by Dean Linda Ammons, who at the time was the dean at both the Delaware and Commonwealth law schools. And she was prescient in thinking that it would be important to talk about issues that impacted diversity, inclusion, equality, acceptance, and belonging. So I'd like to honor Linda today and let the students know that Linda Ammons is returning from Las Vegas in the summer to teach a one-week class called Art Law. So if any of you are interested in signing up for an intercession course with former Dean Ammons, she'll be here this summer teaching Art Law. One of the things that I have tried to do as dean of the law school is really lean into the fact that I think one of the most important things we do at Widener Law Commonwealth is that we are a diverse population that celebrates everybody here. I believe that diversity in thought, diversity in gender and race, diversity in all walks of life bring better outcomes to all rooms, including classrooms, boardrooms, places where folks have the opportunity to use their life experience to lean into the opportunities that have come and have been presented to them. And I think that that's one of the things that's best about us. In fact, our pathway program at Widener Law Commonwealth specifically reaches out to first-generation students, students from historically marginalized populations, where we provide about 12 weeks of LSAT training to help folks overcome the obstacle of the LSAT to get into law school. And we have many students sitting in our classrooms today that have come through our pathway program. And I'm really delighted to let everyone know that the Law School Admissions Council has just provided a $110,000 grant to our law school for our law students to teach the LSAT. That would have required you to have smoked the LSAT. So if you did, you can come and talk to me about potentially teaching in the program. But they hired Widener University Commonwealth Law School to teach 1,000 plus guided journey students how to succeed on the LSAT and how to get into law school. And that is us. They could have gone to any of the 200 law schools in the United States to run their LSAT programming for their plus guided journey, and they came to us to do that. And people like Eli Ziegler and Stephanie Kennedy and others teach in that program. And I'm really delighted to let you know that we had this contract last year, and we have over 25 students from that program that have applied to Widener Law Commonwealth, 15 or so of whom have been admitted, several into the TAP program. This is about access. It's about opportunity, and it's about celebrating what's great about us, which is the diversity that we have amongst ourselves in our classrooms and at our law school. So in the tradition of the Dean's Diversity Forum, we ask some of our student affinity group leaders to come up and spend a few minutes talking about what the group does, why they're important to our campus, and thereafter we are going to dive into corporate responsibility now, ! Reframing immigration and repairing historical wrongs. I'm really excited about today. To our audience on Zoom, we welcome you. We're happy that you're here with us. To our audience in the room, let's have a wonderful Dean's Diversity Forum today, and I look forward to that. First of all, I'd like to ask Jermaine Harris, the president of the Black Law Student Association, to come up and talk about BALSA. I will share with you that Jermaine has been, I don't have favorite students, but Jermaine is one of the students that I deeply appreciate, have love for because of his leadership on campus. And one of the very first things that Jermaine did when I became dean was he walked right up to me, "Hi, Dean, I'm Jermaine Harris. What are your plans for our law school? How are you going to help us elevate?" So not only does he own his space, but he cares very much about our institution, who we are, what we're becoming. I'm really excited about Jermaine's future. He already has his job locked down in Jim Thorpe. So after he smokes the bar in his first attempt, he will be practicing law in Allentown, doing really great things. So Jermaine, if you'll come talk to us about BALSA for a few minutes.
Good morning, everyone. All right. My name is Jermaine Harris, and I serve as the current president of the Black Law Students Association, otherwise known as BALSA, at Widener University, Commonwealth Law School. BALSA is dedicated to the academic, the professional, and the personal development of Black law students. Our mission is to foster a supportive and empowering community that promotes excellence, leadership, and advocacy within the legal profession. We strive to ensure that every member is equipped with the resources, the mentorship, and the opportunities necessary to succeed in the law school and beyond that. Through tailored professional development programs, networking events that we've had, and partnerships with law firms, public interest organizations, and government agencies, we work to position our members with long-term success while contributing to the advancement of justice and equality in the broader society. This year, our organization has continued to grow in mentorship and impact. We have hosted a range of events, including our Black History Month panel, a Young Attorneys panel, and several networking opportunities designed to connect our members with legal professionals. In addition to programming, we have placed a strong emphasis on student support and retention. Our initiatives have included group study sessions, peer mentorship, and intentional community building efforts aimed to strengthen both academic performance and a sense of belonging within the law school environment. One of our primary goals this year was to improve the retention rate and overall success of minority students, which we have. And we worked very diligently towards that goal and building a strong supportive network and fostering collaboration among all students. So it is truly a privilege to lead this organization and to represent diversity alongside the many groups that contribute to this great campus. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Natalie Solano, who's the president of our Latin American Law Student Association. And I think it's true to say that if I'm the dean of the law school, Natalie Solano runs the law school. She is in charge of nearly every student organization that I know. Her presence on campus has been phenomenal. I should mention both Jermaine and Natalie have hired both of them to work for the dean in the dean's office. Jermaine is one of our development liaisons, and Natalie works for me in some of the outreach and graphic designing that I do for the law school. But Natalie is a force of nature, and those of you that know her know that if I need anything, especially if I need attendance at an event, I'm like, Natalie, round up your people, like, let's go. And Natalie's presence and leadership in the Latin American Law Student Association has been phenomenal. And one of the things that I love that LALSA does is the Dia de la Muertes, Day of the Dead, ofrenda that they set up every year, and we have the opportunity to remember our departed. It's just one of the many things that LALSA does here on campus. So I'd like to give Natalie an opportunity to spend a few minutes talking about the Latin American Law Student Association.
Good morning, everyone. Hi. My name is Natalie Solano, and I am honored to serve as the president of Latin American Law Students Association. First, I want to thank Dean Cummings for bringing us together and for Widener's commitment to creating a supportive and inclusive environment for its students. For me, LALSA is more than just an organization. It's personal. I moved to the United States from Dominican Republic when I was 7 years old. I didn't speak any English, and honestly, I didn't even know America was cold. Everything was new, unfamiliar, and at times very overwhelming. Because of that experience, community has always meant something deeper to me. I didn't have a roadmap or a warning for what transition would feel like. And now, as president of LALSA, my goal is to help create that sense of community and guidance for others, so that no student feels like they're navigating these spaces alone. That's what LALSA strives to do every day. Yes, we build community through events like the guacamole competition, but we also create meaningful opportunities for students to connect, grow, and see themselves in this profession. Through panels and programming, we bring in attorneys and professionals who share similar backgrounds, giving our members insight, mentorship, and vision of what's possible. And what makes that possible is the support we receive here at Widener. The administration, faculty, and broader community create an environment where organizations like LALSA can thrive, and where students from all backgrounds are encouraged to succeed. Because diversity in law isn't just about representation, it's about perspective. It strengthens advocacy, deepens understanding, and ultimately allows us to better serve our community. As LALSA's president, I am proud to be a part of that effort and proud to be a part of a law school that continues to support and uplift its students in meaningful ways. Thank you.
We have many other wonderful affinity groups on our campus. Did not have the opportunity to be here today to speak, but I wanted to ask our final student speaker, David Duggan, to talk about the Center for Equity and Justice. So David has been hired as one of the Center Fellows. He was responsible, along with Eli Ziegler, Gabe Kuhn, and Haley Nelson, for much of the programming that you'll see today. And they essentially assist us in running, no, they don't assist us, they actually run the Pathway program. Professor Feldman and McGee and I just kind of show up for the work that they do. But it's really interesting, the work that David does in interviewing. We have over 100 applicants for the program. We have about 20 seats. And we rely on David and Haley and Eli and Gabe and Tara to interview the applicants, seat them in the class. And we have so much confidence in these student leaders that we literally show up and everything is done and ready. And David is just an extension and a part of that at the Center for Equity and Justice. So I've asked David to talk about the Center for Equity and Justice, and then he will moderate our first panel. So I'll invite Jena Martin to come up here and join us. And David, the floor is yours.
Good morning. My name is David Duggan, and I'm a student here at Widener University Commonwealth Law School. As Dean Cummings said, I will be moderating our first panel, but before we get there, I would like to say a few things about Widener's Center for Equity and Justice. As Dean Cummings said, I worked for the center as a fellow alongside my extraordinary classmates Eli Ziegler, Haley Nelson, and Gabe Kuhn. The center is dedicated to promoting justice and creating equal opportunity for marginalized communities in the legal profession. One way that we work towards achieving that goal is through our Pathway program. The Pathway program seeks to break down barriers to ensure that those who want to enter the legal profession have an equal opportunity to do so. And the program levels that playing field by providing free 12-week LSAT preparation made possible with a generous grant by the Law School Admissions Council. By providing this free LSAT preparation, the center uplifts people from populations that have been historically discriminated against, people who are first-generation students, people from rural communities, people who have little to no financial means, people who, due to no fault of their own, have faced barriers to receiving adequate LSAT instruction. But beyond the instruction itself, the Pathway program says something to people that they may never have heard before. You belong. You belong in the law. You belong in the legal profession. In fact, just a few weeks ago, our current cohort, made up of hardworking, dedicated students from around the nation, visited our school for our Day at the Law School event. And they sat in these chairs, and among many other things they got to do, they participated in a law school class. So that not only were they told you belonged in law school, but they actually saw themselves in law school. And they knew it is now possible because of this program. In addition to the Pathway program, the Center for Equity and Justice has partnered with Walmart for an enhanced community policing project. This project analyzes policing practices in low-income areas, with the goal of improving community police relationships. The research in this project will focus on retail theft of necessities, such as food and baby diapers, and how law enforcement should justly handle these incidents. This is important work that needs to be done, and Widener stands as a leader in moving us in the right direction. While the Center for Equity and Justice helped plan this event today was only made possible because of our distinguished speakers who agreed to speak, and because of each of you attending today. I thank you all for your attendance, both in person and virtually, and I hope you all enjoy the 19th Annual Dean's Diversity Forum. Now, as we move into our panel, I would just like to note that, time permitting, there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of each discussion. So if you have a question during the panel, please just write it down so you can ask it at the end. Our first panel is titled Repairing Historical Wrongs, a conversation that deserves to be had at any time, but one that is particularly timely to be held now. And I can't think of better people to engage in this conversation than our three panelists. Firstly, we have Christian Johnson, a graduate of Columbia University School of Law. He is a professor of law at Widener University Commonwealth Law School, where he teaches a variety of business law courses. He is currently the director of the Business Advising Program and is formerly dean of this law school. Before joining Widener, Professor Johnson was a professor of law at University of Utah School of Law and Loyola University Chicago School of Law. Professor Johnson speaks frequently on legal issues involving over-the-counter derivative reforms, capital markets, and the financial crisis, and has spoken and lectured at central banks, U.S. banking and financial regulators, and academic and financial institutions around the world. Prior to a career in academia, Professor Johnson was an associate attorney for Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy in New York, as well as Mayer, Brown, and Platt in Chicago. And he was also a certified public accountant for Price Waterhouse. Our second speaker will be Andre Douglas Pond Cummings. A graduate of Howard University School of Law, he is currently Dean and Professor of Law at Widener University Commonwealth Law School. He was formerly Associate Dean for Faculty of Development and the Charles C. Baum Professor of Law at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, William H. Bowen School of Law, where he taught a variety of courses including business associations, corporate justice, and hip-hop in the American Constitution. While there, he was a co-founder and co-director of Bowen Law's Center for Racial Justice and Criminal Justice Reform. Dean Cummings has also been a professor of law at West Virginia University College of Law and has been a visiting professor at a number of law schools. Before embarking on his academic career, Dean Cummings clerked for both the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit and the Utah Supreme Court. In addition, he practiced at Kirkland & Ellis, one of the largest and most respected law firms in the world, where he focused his practice on complex business transactions, including mergers and acquisitions and securities offerings. Dean Cummings has written extensively on issues regarding investor protection, racial and social justice, and sports and entertainment law, having co-authored multiple books and having been published in a variety of law journals. Lastly, we have Jena Martin, a graduate of Howard University School of Law. Professor Martin is Catherine A. Ryan Chair of Global and International Law and Professor of Law at the St. Mary's University School of Law. Her research in the field of business and human rights, her research is in the field of business and human rights, where she has written extensively on many issues, including the intersection of human rights with a number of fields, including data privacy, AI, and security regulation. Professor Martin is an intellectual leader on these subjects, and her work has been presented in a variety of forums, including newspapers, law journals, and the United Nations. Professor Martin has also co-edited and co-authored a number of books in the field of security regulations and business and human rights. Prior to joining St. Mary's, Professor Martin was the Robert L. Schuman Professor of Law and Ethics at West Virginia University. Outside of academia, Professor Martin has served as a consultant and advisor for small businesses and as senior counsel for the Securities and Exchange Commission's Division of Enforcement. Thank you all to the panelists for being here today, and we all look forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
honored to be here. Very exciting to have a chance to talk about these issues. All I think about really are financial institutions. That's my focus, what I teach about, what I think about, and the intersection, though, of these problems with what financial institutions do is extraordinary and really, really important. You know, for a banker, all he's trying to do is make a good loan. But when we look at the way that he does it and how he's going about it, oftentimes the results are really problematic. Everyone, I think, from at all walks of life would agree that housing, having good housing for all people is really one of the most important things in society. Whether rich, poor, everyone deserves a place to live, regardless of its size or where it's located. It's a really important issue. When we think about what does home ownership do, it's incredibly important for the community. People who own their home tend to stay in those communities, to support them. They vote there, they work on their schools, I like kind of this idea of broken windows in reverse. They keep up their homes, and the communities benefit, and the families are happier, and the individuals are happier there. It's also housing is really important driver of wealth and equity. And most individuals will accumulate a lot of their wealth not through their work, but through the paying off of their mortgages and the appreciation of the homes that they live in. It's an incredibly important aspect that way. It's really important if you're able to own your home. It tends to be a positive in your life. If you are unable to afford a home or you lose your home, it has kind of the opposite effect with respect to the wealth you're able to accumulate. Our tax policies really favor home ownership and tend to drive that and make that happen. When I was thinking about when Dre asked me to participate, I was thinking, what do I write about? Do I write about redlining, which I'm going to be speaking about, which is the exclusion of groups of individuals from credit? In other words, they simply can't get a loan. Or do I talk about sometimes what we call reverse redline? That's the predatory lending idea that's targeting individuals with credit that they can't afford. And we saw that during the great financial crisis, where individuals were given loans but with extremely high fees and interest rates, and was a big factor in what happened in the great financial crisis. And I was looking at these two issues. They're really just different sides of the same coin. And the coin is that indigent individuals and individuals that are part of underrepresented communities are harmed and hurt in all kinds of profound ways by either the redlining or the predatory lending or reverse redlining that goes on. And I chose to focus. They only let me speak for an hour this morning, so I focused on the redlining aspect as we move forward with this. I found a definition on redlining from the Legal Information Institute, which is housed up at Cornell Law School. And it's kind of interesting. Redlining can be defined as a discriminatory practice that consists of the systematic denial of services such as mortgage, insurance, loans, etc., based on their race or ethnicity. And I think from the banker's perspective, he would say, no, it's based on their ability to repay the loan, based on their economic status. And that's kind of where a lot of this tension comes in. The banker says, I just want to make a good loan. But unfortunately, the process of making that loan results in redlining, discrimination, and harms to communities. We talk about, well, how do we allow bankers to make good loans while at the same time not resulting, and I like the word systematic denial. In other words, it's not focusing on an individual's ability to repay that loan, but instead they're part of a group where they live, ethnic group, whatever it might be, as we look at these things. Oddly enough, the practice of redlining emerged from the efforts of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's efforts to tame the Depression and to bring back stability to the housing market. And there was a huge problem during the Depression where individuals of all classes, races, ethnicities, whatever we were losing their homes due to unemployment and the financial problems that were going on during the Great Depression. And they created an organization, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And what it did, it sold bonds and then it bought up from the banks these loans that were struggling and that were probably going to go into foreclosure. And then the government, instead of the bank, would work with these different homeowners in an effort to lower their interest rates and help them avoid foreclosure and to provide some stability. And see, the problem with, as you look at what was going on in the Depression is people couldn't sell their homes, all these kinds of issues. Going into foreclosure, it would drive the market values of these homes down. And they're trying to reverse that, and it was actually remarkably successful when you look at just in terms of numbers. They made by 1935, they'd made over 1 million loans, and they'd gone in. These were all loans where individuals were in danger of losing their homes, able to refinance them and provide some stability. And now where the redlining came in is they thought, well, we really need to figure out then who we're going to help, okay? And so they developed what they called residential security maps. And this is where the government, using extraordinary resources, would go into communities and figure out what areas were more likely in their minds to be successful in refinancing their mortgages. So trying to identify who should we help with these limited resources that we had. And so it started out, I can't imagine that it started out with an idea that we were trying to hurt particular groups, but that's exactly what ended up happening. In particular, as we developed these residential security maps. And they're actually frightening. And that's what's nice about all the effort that's gone into this. We start gathering up data. And you're looking at Pittsburgh, and this is a map that was prepared by the Division of Research and Statistics by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, federal agency, created these maps in an effort to figure out, okay, which areas of town are most likely to be able to refinance and to be successful and to keep their homes. And so green stood for let's help these people. And red, they categorized as fourth grade. These are the areas where, boy, it'd be really dangerous to help them because they'd probably lose their home anyway, even if we did any work with them. And as you look at it, you clearly would say, well, if I want to refinance my loan, I better make sure I live in the green area and not in the red area. Okay, as you're looking at this, and just again, this is where we get this systematic grouping of people based purely on where they live as we're looking at it. This is Pittsburgh. This is the map for Baltimore. Again, you can see the areas, again, green is go, red is stop. Okay, it's very simple as you look at the map. Where do we want to focus our efforts to help people either be able to keep their homes or to get new lending on that? And here's Harrisburg. Again, Harrisburg, I guess, wasn't very happy. There's only one green area, or there's two green areas. Well, three. But kind of interesting. And they did these maps for over 200 different cities. Okay, they really gave the different government regulators a view as to which areas were going to be successful. And there's no redlining here. Well, there is some red lines there. If you kind of peek at the lines there, but the idea, though, is that they've broken these areas into different groups, and the implication, of course, is green is good, red is bad, okay, in terms of extending credit. Now, it's unclear to me as to whether the federal government actually then would not help people in the red areas. I mean, I think that's one thing I don't know. But the existence of these maps, if you can imagine, was really, really helpful for bankers. Okay? It would tell them exactly where the areas where for the people that they want to lend to. Okay, green is good. Green means they're affluent. Green means they can repay their loans. Red means, whoa, there's problems there. Why spend our time there? Okay, marketing and doing these kinds of things. As you look at the grading that they did, they're kind of in bureaucratic speak. As you look at how they would categorize the different areas going way back, green, new, well-planned sections. Okay, synonymous with areas where good mortgage lenders with available funds are willing to make their maximum loans. Okay, and then you've got the D grade, the red, characterized by detrimental influences and whatever undesirable populations, whatever that means. I think, and that's kind of the curious part of this when you talk about redlining. Are they looking at these areas because they just don't think they can repay the loans, or are they looking at these areas because they don't like these underrepresented groups in these areas? And that's kind of the banker would say, I don't care what their ethnicity is, can they repay the loan? That's what the typical banker would try to tell you. More cynical individuals would say, well, they really want to keep different groups in different areas. I lived in Chicago for 16 years. Unbelievably segregated community still after 200 years. If you live on the north side, the far north side, they're white and Asian. If you live in the south side of Chicago, it's almost uniformly African American, and then you've got Hispanic areas and stuff like that. Really, really interesting. And I think the redlining, a lot of these maps, tends to keep those areas looking like they have been historically as you look at it. This is particularly scary when you look at how the government was doing this redlining. Again, I think in a lot of their terms, in their mind, they weren't doing anything wrong. They were simply trying to describe these areas. This is an area in Los Angeles. The first question, class and occupation: Jewish, professional and businessmen, Mexican laborers, WPA workers, which are workers who just needed government work, Russians, Polish, Armenian Jews, Slavs, Greeks, American Mexicans. Very descriptive. This particular area was clearly an area with a lot of underrepresented groups, very diverse, but I think the banker would say, I'm not sure they can repay what their, the obligations that they might be taking, but very descriptive when you look at these different maps as we're looking at it. And I think what I think is really pernicious about these maps is not necessarily what the government itself was doing with them, but because they were available to bankers and other extenders of credit, it gave them what I call a redlining roadmap to discrimination. Okay, it made their job very easy. They had a shortcut to know where the good loan neighborhoods. Okay, they're all green. Okay, they don't even have to research it. They say, don't waste your time going to the red areas. You should be going to the green. And when we're marketing, don't target the red areas. We don't want to lend there. Those people we don't think are going to be able to pay. How do we know that? Well, here's the government's map that shows where these problematic areas are. For regulators, I think regulators probably use the maps. They'd go in and they'd look at the loan portfolios and they'd probably say, okay, show me their loans in the red areas. How are they performing? Really, really interesting. And again, something that we're seeing now with the idea of there being food deserts and other kinds of things or situations where as a business is trying to decide where it's going to put its business, well, go to the red area. I don't think there's much money there. Why would we put a big grocery store there? I mean, those are that's what's really awful about these maps. And these maps all came about because the federal government built them and designed them. And so everybody knew where we should go and where we shouldn't go. And it's reinforcing. If you're in a red area, you want to get out. If you're a green area, you want to stay. Okay, and so it tends to freeze these areas in ways that are really bad for society as you're looking at what's going on with these things. Here's Philadelphia, and their legend was a little different. They've got green is best. Okay, that's the way they described how they were viewing the areas. This kind of purple color is kind of still desirable. Yellow's danger. It's still declining. Red is hazardous. I guess by hazardous they meant don't lend there. Okay, you're probably not going to get repaid if you do these particular situations. And so again, what the practical consequences of these maps and people having information where the federal government says is trying to map affluence and in areas that are going up or going down. Red area is risky, okay? And so accordingly, it became difficult for individuals in those areas to buy homes, which meant you end up with slumlords that buy up the properties on the cheap, rent it out. If you don't have credit for these areas, then people can't buy the homes, and so there's less demand for the homes. And if there's less demand, then prices don't go up, they go down, okay? And so these, as less credit's available, it becomes there's just not as many buyers because there's not as many people getting the credit that they need to do this. Now, this is particularly awful when government, again, your city councilmen and others, or state legislators, they're trying to figure out, okay, we have a new freeway, where should we put it? And they think, well, the red areas are not great. Why don't we just run the freeway right through that particular neighborhood? And you see the Dan Ryan going through the middle of Chicago. Dan Ryan Freeway had a nice effect. If you were on one side, you were in good shape. If you were on the other side, you had a problem. And so they would use these maps to a certain extent to figure out, okay, what areas do we need to fix? And the fixing was not to make more single-family homes available. Instead, it was put in projects and do other things like that. And sadly, people that grew up in these neighborhoods who wanted to leave them, they wanted to stay and they wanted to buy a home in those particular areas. They found it's hard to get credit to buy in those neighborhoods, so they would end up leaving. Okay, so directly these redlining had both direct effects and indirect effects as we're looking at it. Now, when we look at the results of these kind of programs that the government put in place, government's insured a lot of loans. They've helped a lot of people buy homes, $120 billion in home mortgages during a 30-year period, but they all went to white families. That was sort of that's the pernicious effect of what's going on with these kinds of situations. Black families, for example, in these red areas would only qualify for high interest contract sales, making it very difficult for them to set down roots and to buy homes that they wanted to be in and to stay in. Now, and again, you start looking at the 60s, LBJ, the Great Recovery, all the things that went on during the 60s in a good way. You start seeing federal legislation trying to stop this kind of discriminatory lending that's going on. You've got the Fair Housing Act, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, Community Reinvestment Act. Again, huge efforts to try and reverse the bad that the redlining has done and the other kinds of discrimination on credit that was happening on that. A Justice Department had for certain periods of time a lot of litigation and finding really overt situations where it was clear that organizations were not lending based on some kind of a systematic determination that they were not going to lend to these particular neighborhoods, for whatever reasons, and a lot of good litigation was done in an effort to try and reverse this and to try and make things happen. It's tough litigation because the banker's just going to say, "Oh, they didn't qualify," it provides them some cover with respect to these kinds of situations. Again, depending on which party's in control or what the agenda is for what administration, you find a lot of energy or not so much energy going into these particular situations. We're worried now, if you're concerned about these kinds of problems, discrimination in lending and the redlining kinds of situations, it's funny, the names of names of a lot of the initiatives, CRA modernization, roll back. It sounds, well, of course we need to modernize. That's a good idea. Unfortunately, the effect has been to hold the institutions less accountable, and I think most importantly, a lot of the things that are going on right now is there's less data being gathered, and so it's really hard to tell what's going on. You don't know if there's discrimination going on because they're simply not collecting that anymore. And so it becomes harder and harder to identify the practices and the problems that are going on in these particular scenarios as you're looking at it. Now, again, we all love to talk about artificial intelligence. It's supposed to be good. Some people think it's supposed to be bad. All kinds of problems, but clearly, the ability to redline in a variety of areas, these tools have just really made it possible for financial institutions and creditors to target very specifically who they want to lend to and who they don't want to lend to. And in ways they don't need the redline maps anymore, because through artificial intelligence they can identify people based on zip codes, surnames, educational background, their habits, their digital footprints, whatever it is, gives them enormous power to be able to see who's getting the ads, who's going to be put on a fast track to get the loans that they want. Really, really interesting. The other thing that they talk about is we train AI. We all talk about, training AI. Well, the problem is if there's been a bias in how we lend in the past, all that data is going into the models, and we may be training AI to do the same kind of biased lending that we've tried to stop in the past, and something to worry about. I like the last clause, the black box problem. We don't even know how they do it. How can we stop them from, how can we stop this problem if we don't understand how the model works? And so there's clearly a lot of work to be done. I know a lot of you will be focused in this particular endeavor and battle. Artificial intelligence could be used in a good way. It can be used to, if it does identify where the problems are, perhaps we can reverse a lot of these kinds of issues as we're looking at it. The power through digital marketing and steering is just extraordinary. You can decide who's going to get particular promotions on loans and lending opportunities and credit in ways that was unimaginable. It's fascinating. I think the dean would agree with me. We can target different groups on trying to get all of you to come to Widener. I mean, it's extraordinary the power that we have now with all these kinds of things. They have something funny called lookalike modeling. So you figure out, okay, who are our customers, and then AI tells us then, okay, you should be targeting these people because they look like who you're dealing with right now. Differential pricing, again, based on the aspects of the people that you're looking forward. Now, what do we do going forward? How do we redress the I hope I didn't say anything that bothered you. I'm sorry. That's a terrible joke. I'm sorry. I know. I won't take it personally since none of you are in my class, but next semester. I'm kidding. I'm sorry. That's a cheap shots, isn't it, as we do this? So this is my last slide, and it's kind of say, well, what do we do as we look at this problem where individuals in different, whether it's socioeconomic status, ethnicity, race, whatever gender, whatever it is that we're trying to, what we're worried about happening is we clearly continue to need more empirical data. A lot of people would say, we've already fixed the problem. Why are you worried about it? Look at all these integrated neighborhoods. Look at what a good job we're doing. Well, who knows? It's always, I have a friend who's involved with empirical data and research, and he says he never makes any decision until he looks at the data. What's actually happening? Because anecdotally, we all think what we know is happening, and we need to understand and identify where that redlining is going. Okay, we need regulators and attorneys and litigators that understand what is digital redlining, that understand how AI can be used in either direction to deal with these particular problems. The states tend to do good work in fixing these kinds of problems. The federal government's at the mercy of whoever the administration and is directing it, but we can do a lot of good on the state level. And they talk about greenlining programs. Let's identify areas that can use more credit and do more good. And so it's really a huge problem. We're still suffering, again, as I go back to my Chicago analogy, we're still suffering with problems that came out of the New Deal. Certain areas simply didn't get the credit they needed, and they remain segregated. They remain with low home ownership, with low housing values, all kinds of problems. And so it continues to be an issue that we have to redress and focus on, and that's the value of these kinds of programs, where we can talk about these issues and figure out how they work. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Christian, and I'm delighted to be here with all of you today. And I wanted to just take a second to thank David for a terrific introduction. And I'm really delighted that Jena Martin is here with us. She's up from St. Mary's in Texas. Jena Martin and I went to law school together. We were in the class of 1997, dating us. And Professor McGee was our classmate at Howard University Law School. She was a year ahead of us. So we have a little confluence of Howard University Law School in the house. So excited about that. So in the tradition of Howard Law School, and thank you, Brian, and critical race theory, I'm going to tell a story today. Critical race theory is about narrative storytelling, and my whole joint with critical race theory and hip-hop is that hip-hop is also about narrative storytelling. So I'm going to tell you a story. Some of you probably know about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Do you know the story of Greenwood? Is that a story that's familiar? So there was a wonderful Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma called Greenwood. And they were established in the late 1800s, and O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford were two of the early citizens and residents of Greenwood, Oklahoma. And of course, in Oklahoma in the late 1800s, it was segregated. Any of the retail shops in Tulsa, Oklahoma wouldn't allow, they wanted the business of the Black community, but if you went into a retail store, if you wanted to try on clothing, they wouldn't let you try on clothing if you were African American. They wanted your business, but they wanted you to shop in the back of the store, and they didn't want people to know that they were selling to African Americans. And so O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford hit upon this winning strategy, which is O.W. Gurley bought up some land in Greenwood, Oklahoma, and he started selling land to all of the Black residents that were coming to Tulsa, Oklahoma, on really great credit rates, so they could buy land and establish a store or a shop. And J.B. Stratford was one of the people that went to O.W. Gurley, and he said, I want to open a hotel. And so he opened a hotel called the Stratford Hotel in Greenwood, Oklahoma, and it became the most prominent, fanciest Black-owned hotel in the United States of America. And so O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford hit upon the strategy, we don't need the white retailers in Tulsa, we're going to create all of the retail stores that we need here in Greenwood. And they did that. So here's a picture of Black Wall Street. And at one point, the promise of Black Wall Street was that it was going to be a completely self-contained Black community where everyone supported each other's businesses, and even the folks that went into Tulsa, even the laborers and the folks that cleaned homes and such, they went into the white neighborhoods, made their money, but brought their money back into Black Wall Street. And they went to all of the shop owners and stores and theaters, and Black Wall Street became just this beautiful, prominent, fully Black-owned, self-sustaining community that became very powerful as O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford, at the time of the Tulsa Race Massacre, had developed businesses and were themselves in the early 1900s worth millions of dollars. And this is just some of the photographs of how Black Wall Street developed. And it became so prominent, Black Wall Street did, that it was said that a dollar bill would exchange hands 30 times before it would leave the community. So what you're talking about here is a black self-contained community that had dozens of lawyers, medical doctors, musical theaters, tailors, auto repair stores, transportation magnates. They developed this burgeoning, successful community that had very wealthy residents in very nice homes. Okay, so in Tulsa, there was a young 19-year-old shoe shine boy named Dick Rowland. And he was shining shoes at the bottom of a large high-rise building in Tulsa. And he couldn't use the restrooms on the first floor because they were white only. So he got onto an elevator to use the restroom on the 9th floor. And on the elevator, there was a young white woman, 16-year-old, who was working the elevator. And apparently Dick Rowland stumbled and bumped into her on his way out of the elevator. And this young woman, Sarah, let out a little squeal. He apologized, went to the restroom. That little squeal and the bumping turned into a thing where the law enforcement came and arrested Dick Rowland for, Sarah Page was her name, for assaulting Sarah Page and took him into custody in the Tulsa police station. And in the 1920s, any allegation of assault of a white woman by a black man was going to lead to a lynching. And so at the time in the 1920s, the black veterans had returned from World War I and were sort of tired of this sort of terrorism and lynching of black Americans. And so a group of black World War I veterans, maybe 100 of them, marched down to the Tulsa police station and just kind of surrounded it because they weren't going to let Dick Rowland be lynched on their watch. And so there were 100 black World War II veterans surrounding the jailhouse, and then a white mob started gathering because, you know, apparently Dick Rowland had assaulted Sarah Page, and over 1,000 white Tulsa mobsters surrounded the police station with 100 black war veterans armed, not allowing them to get in and get their hands on Dick Rowland. What happened was during the scuffling back and forth, a shot rang out, and then a full-on gun battle ensued. 5,000 white mobsters descended upon this beautiful Black Wall Street and destroyed it. Burned it to the ground. 300 black residents of Tulsa, of Greenwood, were shot and killed. There were, at the time, there were local airplanes that were flying over Greenwood, dropping kerosene bombs. They just took what was here and turned it into this. So they absolutely eviscerated Black Wall Street, burned it to the ground. Now, one of the things that O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford had done was, like any good business owner, once they established their business, they got insurance. So they insured their businesses against all sorts of, fire and flood and what have you. But after probably about 24 hours, Black Wall Street was just devastated, and black families were chased out of Tulsa. They were killed, murdered. Recently, a mass grave was found in Tulsa where a lot of these African-American citizens were buried. And you can just see that what's particularly interesting in this slide is that the Dreamland Theater was kind of a big deal. Like, people from around the country would come to the Williams-owned Dreamland Theater, and it was also devastated, burned to the ground. And this is just sort of a picture of the white mob just rampaging through Greenwood. So Greenwood was razed, R-A-Z-E-D, just burned to the ground. When the residents started trying to put their lives back, 1,000 homes were burned to the ground. It wasn't just the businesses. It wasn't just Black Wall Street. It was the homes. It was the businesses, just devastated. Some of the lawyers set up tents in the rubble, and they immediately started filling out insurance claims, right? Because all of these businesses had been insured. And John Hope Franklin's father was one of the lawyers that set up a tent and started filling out claims for burned down homes, for burned down businesses. And of course, Tulsa categorized the massacre, because there were no white casualties, there were only Black casualties, as a race riot. And some of you may have heard of Tulsa's race as a Tulsa race riot. That's what it was known as for years, because that's what the Tulsa legislature categorized it, as a riot. And the African American community was eviscerated once by the rampaging mob. The second time it was eviscerated was by the insurance companies, who denied every single claim. So hundreds of businesses, thousands of homes, nobody rebuilt, because the insurance companies denied every single home burn claim, every single business burn claim, because they said the Black residents were rioting. And because the Black residents were rioting, Black Wall Street, this beautiful burgeoning Black Wall Street, was never rebuilt. O.W. Gurley was worth about $5 million in 1919, and I'm not really good on the math when I do things like this, but 2023 dollars was something like 500 million. So his worth would have been significant at that time. And J.B. Stratford and his hotel was worth $2 or $3 million, making his net worth today something like $200-300 million. And so the point that I always try to make when I talk about Black Wall Street and the destruction of it, and the second destruction, which was engaged in by the insurance companies, is that incredible Black wealth was destroyed and never returned. Oprah Winfrey and Robert Johnson are the first Black billionaires in the United States. 1990s. I posit that O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford should have been the first Black billionaires in the 1900s, but they were not. J.B. Stratford could have become the Marriott Corporation. O.W. Gurley could have become Jerry Buss or Stephen Ross, a real estate magnate, but instead, these two men died, both of them penniless. J.B. Stratford in Chicago, where he ran for his life because the Tulsa police were trying to say he was a progenitor of the riot, and O.W. Gurley, penniless in California, also ran for his life in order to survive. So here's the thing that kills me, that slays me, is that this isn't the only instance. This isn't the only Black Wall Street that was devastated. In fact, there's a moniker called the Red Summer of 1919 because so many communities were wiped out by white mobs. Elaine, Arkansas, Chicago, Illinois, Rosewood, Florida, and so many others, where we're talking about successful Black communities, entrepreneurs, businesses that were wiped out and never repaired in any way. And the part that slays me is, here are the insurance company names that denied the claims in 1921. The Hartford, Chubb, CNA International, AIG. They continue to exist today, and in refusing to pay out the claims on insurance, when I pay insurance, my expectation is that when I go to the hospital, my insurance is going to cover. When my daughter damages my car, I expect that the insurance company is going to pay. None of the people in any of these communities were ever paid for the insurance premiums that they paid. And so my whole idea or talk today is, why not why not in 2026 repair? Chubb and CNA and AIG had quarterly earnings last year in the hundreds of millions of dollars, quarterly earnings in the hundreds of millions of dollars, meaning annual earnings are in the billions. And why wouldn't Chubb or the Hartford or CNA say, you know what? We were responsible for a historical wrong. Let's right that. Let's make that right. But for some reason, the word reparations has become taboo. Like we're paying people for the sins of a former generation. They don't deserve it. But I'm telling you right now, the Black generational wealth that was lost has destroyed communities. Can you imagine if the Marriotts were burned down? Or the, Jerry Buss family? I keep referring to them because they own the Lakers. But can you imagine, insurance companies refusing to repair that historical wrong? So my question that I always like to talk about and ask about is, what would motivate a corporation to do the right thing? What would motivate AIG or CNA or the Hartford or Chubb to actually do the right thing? Do you have any idea? This is the interactive part of the conversation. What? Yes, sir. Public backlash. That's called a boycott. When Jena and Kellen and I were at Howard, Jesse Jackson came and talked to us, and he talked about the power of the boycott. Can you imagine if just several thousand of us went to the Hartford and said, you know what, I'm not going to use you as an insurance company because of how you did Black Wall Street? Fabian.
Showing that CEOs are now a potential reach and that they're not safe because of the amount of backlash that is coming, so that spark of outcry is growing?
There is power. There is power in the consumer, right? And one of the things that I'd really like to tie into what Professor Johnson was talking about, who I'm also delighted to be on the panel with. Professor Johnson and I have been friends for a very long time. He may be those of you that are happy I'm the dean here, maybe he was responsible for inviting me to come and interview for this position. If you are unhappy with that, then you can be unhappy with him as well. But he's been a mentor and a friend. We met in Chicago years and years ago. But he talked about predatory lending and destruction of the African-American dream. This book by Janice Sarah and Cheryl Wade, who's a friend of ours, Cheryl looked at the financial market crisis and found that the banks targeted Black families with predatory lending and put them into loans that there was no way that they were going to be able to repay based on their income and what was happening. And Dorothy Brown, also a friend of ours, wrote a book a year or two ago about the whiteness of wealth, how the tax code is basically for white people, discriminates against African American and Latino families. So these echoes continue today. But my point is, and where I'd like to leave off, is that it doesn't have to. I am convinced that if Chubb or the Hartford heard from enough of their customers that they needed to repair a historical wrong, that they would, because it's the public backlash that was talked about. It's the era that we're in today where we could literally make a difference if that was a decision that we decided to make. And here's why I think that's important. Reparations, people always think about a check, right? It doesn't have to be in the form of writing a check. There are descendants of those families. O.W. Gurley and J.B. Stratford have descendants that are living on the edge now who would have been generationally wealthy had Black Wall Street not occurred. Chubb and CNA could offer free insurance. They could offer job training programs within their corporations. They have thousands of people that work for them. They could offer scholarships and interest-free loans for education. There's so much good that these companies could engage in that doesn't look like cutting a check to someone that was a descendant of the Black Wall Street survivors. And the thing that's frustrating about Black Wall Street is that they've continued to sue for reparations, the city, And the judiciary continues to say time lapse, latches, all of these reasons why there's no recompense for the folks that were devastated and burned out in 1921. So yes, it's 100 years ago. But yes, their descendants continue to live and survive. And I believe that if we engaged in aggressive corporate repair conversations and pressures and boycotting, that there could be not government reparations, there could be corporate, private repair. And I think that is something that we should think about and that we should be aggressive about getting into. So I look forward to talking more about this in the Q&A. I'm thankful for all of you being here today, and I will turn it over to Professor Jena Martin.
Hi, I'm Jena Martin. I don't have a PowerPoint, so are you guys okay if I just sit and chat with you from here, or do I need to do all the proper and stand and, I mean, because I can, I just don't make me. Is it okay if I sit? Okay.
My time
That was his time telling me it was up. So, because Dean Cummings and I have known each other for close to 30 years now. Oh, over 30 years, 94. I'm going to tease him because I can. And I'm going to sort of use that as my backhanded apology. So I found out Dean Cummings had asked me a few weeks ago to come in and to speak, and I had an opening, so I said yes. And he said in the text, because he just texted me, he said, we're talking about corporate social responsibility, historic immigration problems. And I said, well, don't know much about immigration, but I know something about corporate social responsibility. And it wasn't until last night when Dean Cummings was like, actually, this is about corporate social responsibility and historical harms. And I was like, oh, is it? Is it now? Luckily, what I wanted to talk to you guys about today sort of acts as a linchpin for what's happening this afternoon, right? Which is when folks come in and they're going to talk about immigration. So I want to talk about this idea of immigration within the historical context and within the context of corporate social responsibility. But I'm not an expert, so I'm going to start with an expert who is going to sort of set the scene. Oh, no, not him. Okay, for those of you who don't know, that is the very talented Lin-Manuel Miranda, who was talking about the Battle of Yorktown in 1798. Immigrants at the forefront handling it. Immigrants have been around since the dawn of the country. I think we all know this. What may be less well known is just how much immigrants have been involved in building the country, literally on their backs. Right, so the story that I know the most about is Chinese workers who came over at the dawn of the 19th century, who helped build the railroads in West Virginia, where I used to live, and where Professor Cummings, Dean Cummings, before he abandoned me, recruited me to come and teach at WVU. In West Virginia, there were Italian workers who would work in the coal mines. In Texas, where I currently live, there is a long history of immigration, including Mexican immigration, although actually technically it's us immigrating to Mexico and then just taking the country. Don't have time for that story, so we'll talk about that another time. But from 1904 to 1914, there was this movement in Texas, which is probably less well known, called the Galveston movement. It is when Eastern Europeans, primarily Jewish, were running away from rising anti-Semitism. And This story in particular I find helpful because it highlights one of the things that Dean Cummings was talking about within the context of corporations and corporations' response, right? Because corporations and their response to things or their lack of response to things has two sides. Dean Cummings talked about it within the context of corporations who did not respond, right? Insurance companies who did not respond after the Tulsa massacre. But sometimes corporations do get involved, and they get involved in issues like immigration. They get involved in issues across the social spectrum, and that comes up within the context of corporate social responsibility. That's usually how I know about it. I know we talked about it as corporate responsibility, but usually it comes up within the context of corporate social responsibility. And so the Galveston movement is particularly interesting because it was brought about by a man named Jacob Schiff, who in 1907 launched the Jewish Immigration's Information Bureau to encourage Jewish immigration to the North American interior. It was because there was a concentration of Jewish immigrants on the East Coast, and he believed that sort of intense congregation encouraged anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic sentiment. So he committed $500,000, again in 1907 dollars, and hoped to move up to 4 million Jews into the interior in the United States and Canada within 10 years. But what people don't know much about is that Schiff was a Wall Street businessman, right? And so to be clear, he wasn't really acting as a philanthropist. He was acting as a businessman. He understood that concentrated immigrant poverty in New York would provoke a political backlash that would close off immigration entirely. So his motivation was part humanitarian, part strategic protection of the Jewish immigration population. That's kind of what corporate social responsibility is all about, right? It's this idea of mixing strategy, business, and social humanitarian efforts together. This still happens today. Today, though, there's a little bit of a twist. Back then, when they did it, it was just philanthropy. It's the thing that you did. I'm going to donate to Princeton because it's the thing one does with one's money. Now, we have this label of corporate social responsibility explicitly in there. So we should probably define our terms. You know, it's the law professor in me. I'm going to talk about that. So what is it? It's corporations acting within this veneer of like, how do you help the people? Has anyone here studied or heard of this? I also have an interactive portion. You guys didn't realize you were coming to another class. Corporate social responsibility. Anyone here has heard of it? Hello. Tell me what you've heard about corporate social responsibility.
I mean, corporations have a responsibility to, they are making money off of the backs of people, so they have a responsibility to take care of the people that they are, making money off of.
Okay, and excellent. You're doing great. Where does this responsibility come from? The consumer, okay. Any other thoughts about corporations' responsibility, where that comes from? Yes, sir.
Framed as a way to be in front of regulation, for instance, implementing net zero policies before the government makes you implement net zero policies.
Okay, and where would that, you're absolutely right, where does that impetus come from?
Thinking about what costs will come.
Okay, forward thinking, strategic thinking, from who though?
Boardroom, I imagine.
Okay, so the business itself, would you say? Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right. So when we're talking about corporate social responsibility, we tend to think of it as coming from the businesses themselves, partly because of consumer demand, right? Partly because of pressure from employees, sometimes investors, but the impetus comes from this idea of corporations and the business leader taking on the business leadership initiative that they should. There's a gentleman by the name of Archie Carroll who talks a lot about and has written a lot about corporate social responsibility. And in 1979, he came up with this foundational definition. It's 4 parts. He talks about businesses' behavior that is economically profitable, complies with the law, is ethical, and is also socially supportive. Carol is famous in particular for coming up with the CSR pyramid, showing how CSR evolves from its basic, I just have economic responsibilities, to legal responsibilities, then to ethical responsibilities, and finally discretionary responsibilities. So where companies engage in initiatives to help out their communities, workers, and the environment at large. Notice here, though, excuse me, that the definition of CSR is often really top-heavy, right? It's coming from the people at the top, the executives, the CEOs, the CFOs. They're oftentimes pet projects of what management wants to do. So for all of you business association refugees, there's a very famous case about one of the CEOs who wanted to donate to Princeton. And was he allowed to donate to Princeton? He just happened to be an alumni of Princeton. That had nothing to do with it. No, he just thought that was a good initiative. And how does that work within the ultra-virus doctrine at the time, right? But this idea of CSR, the concept of CSR, has been around for quite a long time. It's just we haven't been really explicit about this notion and putting it in a framework. But to me, CSR, even as it's evolved now, isn't sufficient, right? When we're talking about this idea of how to help social initiatives, particularly within the context of immigration, it's this framework that, because it's so top-heavy, it's tied to what corporations want you to see, right? Because corporations, executive, they're going to do not just what they think is right, but maybe also what they think looks good. And unfortunately, there can be a downside to that. So let's say the CSR initiative is that they're going to build orphanages. They're going to go into the Dominican Republic and they're going to build orphanages, or go to Tanzania and they're going to build orphanages. Two things I know a little bit about, which is why I use them specifically. Well, sometimes the sort of underside of that is that those orphanages are there so that they can now have, quite frankly, a steady supply of child labor to use to do things. And it might start out small as like, oh, well, we want to get them involved in the workforce. And next thing you know, it's, oh, well, we want to get them more involved in the workforce and pay them less. Right? So there is definitely a downside to things that start out even within the context as these sort of promising social initiatives. So West Virginia coal towns, I talked about those earlier, Italian immigrants coming to West Virginia and creating these coal towns. Some people might argue that's a form of CSR, right? They provided shelter, they provided education for the workers' children. In fact, you guys not 90 miles north of Harrisburg had the equivalent of that. They called them patch towns instead of coal towns, but it was the same concept. It was the Eckley Miners Village in Weatherly, Pennsylvania. Apparently, there is still a museum in that place now. And these patch towns operated under the same model of coal towns. And that is, they provided, instead of money to the workers, they provided scripts. Does anyone know what scripts are? Yes, sir. What's a script?
They're kind of like that they would give that were only able to be redeemed at the stores that were in that town.
Fake cash. I think that's great. Sorry, you said that immediately I was like crypto. No, sorry. No, not the same at all. No, but yes, it was fake cash. It was money that was tied specifically to that town that could only be used in that town. So what does that do? It means that those people who work there are stuck there. They can only have their wealth grown there. It's exactly the opposite of what Dean Cummings was talking about when he was talking about Black Wall Street, right? It's instead of them making money and bringing it in to support their community, now they have no choice but to use it to further the businesses and the profit models of those people in that town. And let me tell you, the people in that town were not bringing it back into their community, right? So that's the downside of these ideas of when you mix business and society. So particularly within the context of immigration, it can come up in some really consequential ways, right? So today, Starbucks has launched several immigrant-focused CSR initiatives, including hiring refugees, supporting immigrant entrepreneurs, and advocating for immigration reform. There's one initiative in particular, the Starbucks College Achievement Plan, which offers tuition reimbursement and academic support for eligible immigrant employees in the US who want to pursue a bachelor's degree. Sounds great. There's also the corporate-backed lobbying groups such as Forward US and the American Business Immigration Coalition, who have stayed involved in immigration politics and tried to pursue sort of a more friendly immigration policy. Walmart, Chobani, they co-founded the Corporate Roundtable for the New American Workforce, an immigration worker integration program. But the downside is, because CSR is voluntary, it means it can change at the whim of management. So let's say a certain CEO who is very pro-immigration and has built his plant and his factory by using immigrants, he leaves. New administration, maybe, hypothetically speaking, completely ungrounded in anything in reality. But then you have a new CEO or a new administration, and there's pressure to maintain the same level of productivity, right? Because they have used immigrants to support their workforce, but now they don't have the same administrative helpful conditions to do that. What does the new CEO do? Well, within the immigration framework, the consequences are pretty disastrous when it fails or when priorities changes. And the dark side of immigration in that context is one that I know a little bit about: human trafficking. It can take a lot of forms: child labor, exploitive labor practices, forced labor, and it's pervasive. In Texas, where I live, there have been 10,997 cases identified this year, with 24,876 victims, according to the National Trafficking Victims Hotline. Pennsylvania, I'm sorry to say, is not much better. It is consistently listed among the top 10 states by volume. But now add to that an environment of fear, where ICE agents patrol cities and airports and make arrests of people who are coming home from work or leaving, where state actors use children as decoys to force parents into terrible, terrible choices. That, to me, is the failing of CSR. It relies on human whims, and human whims are flawed. So, there's hope, though. Let me offer an alternative approach: BHR, business and human rights. On the surface, business and human rights and CSR might seem similar, and in fact, a lot of people have compared them and conflated them. But as Professor Anita Ramasatri has pointed out, while CSR emphasizes responsible behavior, BHR focuses on a more delineated commitment in the area of human rights. BHR is actually in part a response to CSR and its perceived failure, leading to a gap between the two disciplines, or strands of discourse that are now diverging rather than converging. So, according to the former CEO of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, CSR is designed as a CSR is designed as a top-down approach that is not focused on human rights. The human rights approach is different. It is not top-down, but bottom-up, with the individual at the center, not the corporation. I'm going to say that again because that is the key to business and human rights. With a business and human rights framework, the individual is at the center of the analysis, not the corporation. So, you might ask, what exactly is business and human rights? So glad you asked. It started in the early aughts by a professor, a Harvard professor by the name of John Ruggie, who was assigned by then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to come in and figure out how to deal with this sort of increasing intertwine or intersection between corporations and the society that they live in, governments. Part of the problem comes in, especially with transnational corporations who live in the globalized world that we live in, right? So what happens when you have a corporation whose annual revenue dwarfs the country that it is operating in? So I'm looking at you, Shell in Nigeria, right? Or did you know that if Netflix was now a state or a country instead of a corporation, it would be bigger than Belgium, right? So you have all of these heavily concentrated wealth in a corporation. And again, let me be clear, this is a for-profit corporation. When you think of profits as the impetus, profits as the sort of lodestar, there is one professor at the University of British Columbia, Joel Bakken, who it's pretty provocative. He put together a list of all of the characteristics of what a for-profit corporation means, and then he overlaid it with the DSM checklist for sociopathology. He found that they lined up exactly, right? So failure to engage in long-term relationships, check. Failure to care about larger societal initiatives, check. So now you have this corporation, these businesses with almost unlimited power relative to the countries that they operate in, and, kind of a social pathology. What do? That's the limits of CSR. Business and human rights takes that and says, okay, we understand that that's the thing, but now let's build out these frameworks to address this. So there is a 3-pillar framework that the UN, Professor Ruggie started with the UN. It's called the framework to protect, respect, and remedy. Pillar 1 says that, and I keep using the word states in that I'm an international law person, I mean countries, right? So countries have the obligation to protect its individuals, its societies from business-related harms. Corporations have the responsibility, let me be very clear, it is not a legal responsibility, but we'll get to more of that later, but there is a responsibility to respect the rights of individuals related to business-related relationships, things within their sphere. And both of them have this sort of undefined obligation to remedy whenever there's a harm. So think back to what Dean Cummings was just talking about with regard to the Tulsa massacres, right? If you're looking at this rather from a CSR, we should just encourage the insurance companies to do the right thing, but instead now look at it with a BHR lens, no, you actually have a responsibility, you actually have an obligation to remedy the harm that has occurred. That is the promise of the business and human rights framework. So now let's look at the dark side of immigration, trafficking, right? There is business and human rights, the business and human rights framework took a look at trafficking within the context of international law. And they passed the Palermo Protocol in 2000, the early 2000s. The Palermo Protocol is one of the most heavily ratified treaties in the world, including, and I'm very happy to say this as an international human rights lawyer, the US. We signed and we ratified this. The reason why that's pretty astonishing is if you look at the wider gamut of international human rights law that the US has signed and ratified, there are literally 2 other treaties that we have signed, including, and I'm gonna riff on this because it's just so ridiculous, the Children's Rights Convention, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is literally the most ratified human rights convention in the world. Up until 12 years ago, there were 2 countries that had not signed it. Does anyone want to guess what those 2 countries were? Just take a random guess.
Us and Russia.
China and the US. Okay, we got China. You got one of those right. It was us and Somalia. Not exactly known for its vibrant human rights, but it was us and Somalia. But guess what? Now it's just us, because Somalia has signed and ratified that treaty. So when I say that the US has signed the Palermo Protocol, understand that that is a very, very big deal. And it was designed to address the problems of trafficking. And what it did is it required states to take a look at trafficking within their own countries and address it. And so we had the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is designed to do just that. It is binding law in the US, which allows for victims of trafficking to find protection. And in fact, with the Trafficking Victims Reauthorization Act, there is now a civil law component, right? So it's a multifaceted act. One is that it allows for T visas. So immigrants who want to come in because they have been trafficked can now apply for a special T visa protection. The second is that it allows for people who have assisted, aided, and abetted, and we can talk about that in the Q&A because there's all kinds of things with regard to social media and trafficking. But when as people who have aided and abetted, they can be held both criminally and civilly liable. It's a really hard case to prove. There have not been a lot of successful of cases, particularly when it comes to social media companies, but it's there, and it's law, and it's the thing that we have done. So all that to say, when we're thinking about corporate social responsibility, I would encourage us to think about something more. I would encourage us to think instead about business and human rights. If we want to fix the ills, the problems of society. Because every time this country has left the protection of immigration workers to the goodwill of corporations, it has ended badly. In script, in unpaid wages, in trafficking, in silence. Goodwill, as good as it is, it's not a legal standard. Philanthropy is not a remedy. And a CEO's conscience is not a substitute for the rule of law. Business and human rights doesn't ask companies to be good. It requires them to do no harm. It's a lower bar, but it's a harder obligation, and it's the right one. The country was built on the backs of immigrants. Maybe it's time we build something for them in return. Not a voluntary initiative, not a pyramid, but a right. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you all professors for those insightful remarks, which I know we all appreciated. And has really caused us to think deeper about these issues that are prevalent in our society today. Now we're going to open the floor up for questions to anyone in the audience, for any of the panelists. Does anyone have a question? We have microphones if you have one.
I have several questions, but I'll just try to address a couple of them. First, to Professor, just a moment, Martin.
Hi.
We're Central Pennsylvania. I'm not trying to suggest that's parochial. I'm just trying to suggest that's where we are. Now, why do I say that? We have had here in Central Pennsylvania a remarkable, sterling example of corporate responsibility in the Hershey Corporation and the Hershey Trust. Now, as I mention it not because I'm sure it's flawed. There's probably flaws in almost everything that a human endeavor engages in. But the Hershey Trust created, its original intent was to serve, quote, orphan boys and see that they were cared for. That was way back in the early 1900s. In roughly the 1960s, I don't remember the exact date, the Hershey Trust decided that it wanted to take what I'll call an overabundance of dollars that it had in the trust and engage in using the Cypre doctrine to create a Hershey Medical Center. But it had to go through the normal procedures, the legal procedures to make that happen, which included application into the Dauphin County Common Police Court probate division. I can't remember. It's the Orphans Court. That's what it was. The Orphans Court division, and the Attorney General of Pennsylvania and my former law firm under the leadership of Gilbert Nurick at McNeese Wallace and Nurick engaged in a procedure by which the AG and our law firm and the Dauphin County Court Orphans Court division employed the Cypre doctrine, which all of you have probably studied in one way or another, to allow a substantial sum of money. I can't tell you what it was any longer. I wasn't even really a part of the procedure. I just know the history. To allow the Hershey Medical Center to be developed so that orphan boys and now girls were cared for with medical expenses that were not originally provided in the original Hershey Trust. Okay, that was undertaken under a notion of corporate responsibility. It's proved to be a remarkable enhancement to not only Hershey, but also the entire community. Okay, I offer that as an illustration of what I will call probably many, many excellent results of corporate social responsibility. I don't think you're condemning excellent results at all. I think what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, is to make sure that the BHR, Business and Human Relations, Human Rights model, amplifies what is being done by those corporate elements that engage in good social practices. I think that's what you're saying. Now, in order to say that, I have to acknowledge that there probably are bad CSRs, which would be condemned either because of bad motives, bad results over time, or whatever it might be. But it strikes me that CSR as a corporate concept is not only good in many, many cases, it's to be admired. And if there are flaws that develop in either the inception or the history or the current present of any given illustration, they should be condemned or, if necessary, criminally or civilly prosecuted. But those of us who admire here in central Pennsylvania what Hershey has done ought to be lauded for, or ought to laud the CSR of Hershey. Hershey's just one illustration. There are bound to be hundreds of other types of CSRs that are successful models. And I don't want the baby to be thrown out with the bathwater is what I think I'm saying. And I'm sure, I don't think you would disagree with what I'm saying, but I want to suggest that the CSR model is not a, quote, by definition, bad model. And indeed has worked, notwithstanding probably some serious flaws from time to time. Okay, I've talked long enough. I just wanted to balance what I'll say, your observations. If you agree, fine. If you disagree, that's okay too. That's what our discussion is all about. I had a couple other questions, but there are bound to be other people, so I'm gonna be quiet.
Sorry, so do you want to take a couple questions, or can I respond, or how do you like?
If you can go ahead and respond.
Is that okay? So first of all, thank you so much. I really appreciate the question. And I absolutely agree that there are positive CSR models out there. It's funny, though, that you mentioned the Hershey Corporation, and I understand it was tied to the trust, but the Hershey Corporation is actually kind of infamous in my field because there was a very recent case in the Delaware court that for the first time looked at the Hershey Corporation and how they were dealing with some larger societal issues with regard to worker safety and community. So there's a sort of like a business and human rights case at the sort of dealing with Hershey that is brewing now. And I actually think that that's sort of the perfect crux of the issue that I have with CSR in general, which is I think that CSR, when it is done correctly, is laudable. But I think what happens with CSR oftentimes is corporations will be like, look at this wonderful thing that we're doing over here. Look, it's awesome. Pay no attention to what's happening over here, right? Like, because look, we're doing this wonderful thing. And under a CSR initiative or framework, that's kind of allowed, I guess is the best way of saying it, right? Like CSR doesn't really prohibit people from doing that. And again, corporations are massive, right? When we're talking about transnational corporations, it's completely understandable how Walmart might not understand what they are doing in Mexico through their subsidiaries and through all of their supply contracts. So I'm not trying to condemn the corporation or the issue. I'm just saying that the CSR framework is insufficient to catalog or says it's okay if a corporation says over here, oh, look, we're doing everything okay over here, and therefore don't pay any attention to the man behind the curtain over here, right? Business and human rights, I think, helps with that because a business and human rights framework, or a human rights framework in particular, says you can't negate your bad conduct by having lots and lots of good conduct. Instead, you just have to have good conduct. And so I think that's the missing piece that, particularly when we're dealing with corporations who have this much power, is helpful.
So thank you, all the panelists. It was this has been a really informative presentation. One of the things that I've been thinking about, in my life, my wife is actually far more progressive than I am, and we'll meet at the dinner table, and she'll say, "Well, Vince, I think we ought to consider boycotting Target." And then we'll have a conversation about why we're considering boycotting Target. So what resonates with me is that on some level, I do agree. I think boycotts by the consumer can be effective, but just as we have people that have progressive views on a particular issue, you may have some other individuals that are also customers that don't have these progressive views, and then they'll exert a boycott. So how do you reconcile that, what I think is potentially that conflict, right, to really advance what I think your proposition is?
Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Vince, and it's really good to see you. And Granger, thank you also. It's good to see you as well. And I saw John had a question as well. Okay, so I'm going to try really hard not to turn this into the second part of my talk, but I wanted to. So this is a 2023 article I wrote with Calvin Graham, a former student of mine, published in the St. Thomas Law Review, called "The Black Wall Street Insurance Grift." And I wanted to read the statement of CEO Doug McMillon of Fortune 1 Walmart shortly after the killing of George Floyd. So this is the Walmart CEO, Fortune 1 company in the world. "What I've come to realize is that it wasn't just the physical weight of the officer that killed George Floyd. The forces at work were much greater. Behind the weight of the man was the weight of society, the weight of institutions and structures in which systemic inequity and injustice are ingrained. The weight that killed George Floyd also was the weight of history. 400 years of discrimination against blacks in this country. Together, these forces conspired to crush him. That weight needs to be lifted. It will take broad cooperation of leaders from every sector of society, working together to create a force sufficient enough to bring about the necessary change." So that's what we are doing. So at that moment, Walmart created a shared value network with racial equity divisions. They committed $100 million to racial equity causes. I was in Arkansas at the time with Professor Anastasia Bowles. We made a beeline up to Bentonville and said, we have a center for racial justice that you can get behind if you're serious about these comments. And Walmart carved out $1.5 million for this Center for Racial Justice and Criminal Justice Reform. So that was meaningful, that was real. Of course, 1.5 million is probably about a nickel to Walmart and maybe a couple of seconds of their profit. But to Vince's point, after leaning into this, the DEI backlash hit hard. The administration changed. People started calling Walmart woke mart. And suddenly, to Vince's point, everything changed. We did this big splashy press release when we partnered with Walmart. They started asking us not to put their logo on the material that we were delivering for our court observation project and for what David discussed earlier, the Enhanced Community Policing Project. So to Jena's point, to Professor Martin's point, it's interesting because when you're talking about CSR, and Doug McMillon just stepped down as CEO, and so does Walmart still have this commitment that he had in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder? And I think what Vince illustrates is a problem, which is Professor McGee and Feldman and I are negotiating with Walmart right now on another project, but it is so undercover and so under wraps that like one moment it's green lit and we're going to be bringing several $100,000 to Widener, and then the next moment the general counsel's like nervous that it's going to hit the airwaves, and so it's not green lit any longer. And then So I think to Vince's question, like, how do you navigate that territory? What I've learned in the several corporations that I've worked with is that some of them will lean into the right thing regardless, right? That's the Law School Admissions Council currently. And I have connected with a couple of insiders at Walmart that are just committed. They are going to make this happen regardless of the tides and the winds. And so that's what that's how we pulled the 50,000 recently to Widener from Walmart, is that one of our connects has profit and loss. He oversees a budget and he carves out pieces from his budget to do the good work that we're doing while, well, I guess we're being recorded, but while like keeping it under the radar from, CEOs and GCs that might cancel the contract. So I guess my answer really is I do believe in the power of the boycott, and I do believe that we can make differences in that way. But connecting with the corporations, individuals that are committed, has been the way that we've been able to find success in bringing funds to the right kinds of projects here at the law school. But I think that also supports Professor Martin's point about business and human rights, that if we're relying on the goodwill of the company, the winds are going to blow. And Walmart certainly was one of the first to cave when things started getting threats from an administration about ending DEI efforts. And it's only because of our personal relationship with some of the C-suite individuals that we're able to continue to talk about the work that we're talking about. So it's a problem. It's a conundrum. I don't know if Jena and Christian have anything to add.
It's a terrific question. And the businessman would say, I love everybody. And would want to, or he would say, I'm neutral and not take stands, because that's not my role. My role is to provide best retailing in the world, and not my response. I mean, that's not my role to take a position. I don't know. I mean, I guess you'd have to sort through how sincere are they with that. I mean, is that a legitimate role? I guess that's the first question. Legitimate just to say bad stuff going on in the world? That's not. I'm just here to provide detergent to everybody.
The only thing I think I would add is that these debates have been happening for a really long time, right? So there's a really famous article from 1979 or 1980 in the New York Times by Milton Friedman, who you might know, blah, 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 economist, blah, blah, blah. And he said the responsibility of corporations is to make profits. That's it. Make profits, comply with the law, be done. So these have been happening. And I think maybe to your point, that sort of nuance I want to pull is that it can come in both ways, this idea, this pressure from consumers, because it's not just about a CEO who might want to do the right thing and then the winds change, but maybe the consumer themselves are more conservative, right? So maybe the consumers themselves don't want the sort of woke capitalism, woke thing, and so they're going to boycott Walmart, and so Walmart is responding to that. So I think that the reflections of this is a reflection of larger societal issues that are happening within our society, right? Like, we are becoming more and more divisive. We are becoming more and more polarized. And so to the extent that corporations are reflecting that, it's just a really big magnifier with really big consequences.
Thank you. Hi, Fabian. You kind of hit on this, Professor Martin, in the discussion about CSRs. To me, CSRs are a front. They're nonsensical, and they're just an idea of hiding the truth of what's going on oftentimes. So I guess kind of what I want to know is, what can we look at to start spotting that, and what more can be done to hold those groups accountable and to start pushing in that direction of, redistributing that wealth to support and assist those communities who are struggling from long-term effects of those policies?
Oh, that's a great question, David. Thank you. So as David had mentioned in my little bio, I used to work for the Securities and Exchange Commission and their Division of Enforcement, which was awesome because I got to be like a criminal enforcement person, but I got to see the executives and all the white collar folks. It was great. But I say that to say, I think securities and reporting is a really good starting point. There are more and more initiatives now that are sort of relying on having corporations basically report out what they are doing and not just reporting out all the yay things that we're doing. But so for instance, California has passed the supply chain trafficking, I forget what it's called, I wrote about it, so if you want it, I can tell you the thing. But basically, it said they required all California companies that made a certain amount to report on whether there was any human trafficking in their supply chain. It was actually based on the UK Modern Slavery Act. There has been a bunch of sort of initiatives in Europe that has led to that, but it's sort of this idea of reporting out, right? Like you have to tell what you've done. And to be honest, I'm not a particular fan of the reporting out model by itself because if nobody does anything with that information, it's like, great, we've checked the box, now we're done, now we're moving on. But if society does use the information and gathers it and uses it to pressure corporations, that's where the change happens, right? It's an informed boycott now where you can put pressure on, where you can bring things together and you can say, this is what's happening and this is why. So I think it is sort of, I mean, here's the thing. I think in the end, we're going to have to take a like all hands, multifaceted, whatever you can do approach to make things better. And that's just one aspect I think you could use. Of course.
Hi, I'm John. Just a quick follow-up to the kind of the call that Dean Cummings put out there as to what can we do or how can we make it so that people respond to things like the Tulsa massacre and how can we do right by that. But it kind of goes to the bigger picture of how interrelated so many of these issues are, because I really think it stems from then education. Like who knows about that? Who's learning about that? And who is fighting the ability to be able to learn about that. And I think that's a huge part. Who's going to actually act on this if they don't actually know about this? And so a small segment of people can't make that possible, but it goes to this bigger issue of who's fighting what we can learn, what we can't learn. So I think education's key.
I'm going to just jump in really quick, and it's good to see you, John. So one of the things that I'm super proud of at both Arkansas and here is that our curriculum committees approve classes like policing and the use of force. We have a summer course this year with 2 guest lecturers coming in called Policing the Police. We've approved classes at Arkansas like progressive prosecution and hip hop in the American Constitution, which I think, folks, I just decided to teach as an intercession in the fall. So that's a class you could take, and these go to John's point about education. Like when I started talking about the Tulsa Race Massacre a couple of years ago, most rooms I was in had no idea, just didn't know about it. I was really happy when I asked how many of you had heard of it to actually see that a lot of us have, because if we don't remember history and we don't recognize the fact that corporations have played a role in harming populations in this country, then we're in a situation where we can't expect them to do the right thing if we're not aware of that engagement. And I think in most business associations classes, Professor Martin, Professor Johnson, and I have all taught business associations. I did a survey several years ago that looked at all of the most commonly adopted law school business associations casebooks, and none of them talked about the financial market crisis of 2008. They didn't talk about corporate boardroom diversity. They didn't talk about the evisceration of wealth in Black and brown communities. And so business associations is basically taught as business law is, neutral, which is why Dean Todd Clark and I wrote a book called Corporate Justice, and it sounds to me like we need to invite Jena into our next edition of the book to talk about business and human rights as part of the answer to corporate justice. So education, I think, is really important, but I'm proud of the fact that we are offering classes here at the law school that just, if you want to lean into it and be educated in it, here are opportunities for you to really learn about opportunity and equality and justice and access. And so if you're into it, take those classes because they're, I think, really eye-opening and solution-oriented.
Okay. All right, so I don't see any other questions. So with that, our first panel is over. Please give a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much, the three of you, for speaking. Again, we greatly enjoyed it. We're now going to take a brief break. We do have some lunch out in the hallway. We'll then be returning here for our second panel at 12:30. At 12:30. And thank you all for attending this first panel. Thank you.
For those of you that weren't with us at 10 a.m., I'll just mention this is the 19th annual Dean's Diversity Forum. So while I'd like to take credit for it, it was actually started by Linda Ammons, who was the dean of both the Delaware and Harrisburg campuses at the time, and she really was leaning into how important diversifying the legal profession is and the importance of diversity writ large when we're talking about marginalized populations and the legal academy's need to integrate. So we're proud here at Widener Law Commonwealth to have a pathway program where we provide free LSAT training to students that are interested from first generation and historically marginalized populations. We have a contract with Walmart to do enhanced community policing, and all of this work enables our students to lean into good work on the equality, justice, and equal opportunity front. So with all of that said, I'm really excited about our Reframing immigration panel. Really excited that our speakers have flown in from around the country, and Jill family drove in, and would like to open the floor to Rebecca Feldman, our moderator for this event. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dean Cummings. I am thrilled to moderate this panel, and I want to briefly introduce our three speakers today before I turn the floor over to them. Today we are having, as you know, we're talking about reframing immigration. We are joined by our own Professor Jill Family, Professor David Rubenstein from Washburn University, and Professor Kim Vuden from Mitchell-Hamline University. As many of you know, our own Professor Jill Family is our Associate Dean for Faculty Research and Development, as well as a Professor of Law here at Widener Law Commonwealth. Her scholarship leads to discussion of intersections between immigration law and administrative law. She brings her expertise in the classroom to courses on administrative law, immigration law, and civil procedure, which, of course, is, as she would say, the most important course in first year. I would disagree, being a legal methods professor, so we might have to duke that out, but both very important courses. Professor Family studies the relationships between the three different branches of government in setting, implementing, and interpreting immigration law. She is a renowned expert, a prolific scholar in this area, and her expertise has played a prominent role in hearings before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, Subcommittee on Oversight, Agency Action, Federal Rights, and Federal Courts. Her work has been published in British and Spanish law journals, in addition to many leading U.S. law journals. Professor Family is going to be starting off our discussion today to help us give some grounding basics in corporations' business in the field of immigration law. She will be followed by Professor Kim Vuden, who, as I mentioned, is joining us from Mitchell-Hamline University in Minneapolis. Professor Vuden is the Lewis L. Ainsworth Distinguished Professor in Business and Law, as well as the Director of the Center for Law and Business and Director of the Economic Inclusion Clinic. I met Kim when we taught together, Professor Vuden, I should say, when we taught together at the University of Arkansas Little Rock at Bowen. And she was teaching the Business Innovations Clinic there while I was directing the Veterans Law Clinic. So I'm thrilled that she's able to join us today. Professor Vuden joined Mitchell Hamlin in 2022 after 5 years as a professor and director of that Business Innovations Clinic at Little Rock, and where she was also an adjunct at that school at the Clinton School of Public Service. She founded the Arkansas chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, which coordinated election protection workshops in Black churches and barbershops, trained over 50 law students and lawyers to be legal observers after George Floyd's murder, and coordinated litigation that resulted in every 2020 absentee ballot being counted. So we are thrilled. Professor Vuden is here from Minneapolis. She is going to talk to us a bit about the recent immigration enforcement actions in Minneapolis, including the role of corporate complicity versus corporate dissent. And finally, last but not least, we are joined by Professor David Rubenstein of Washburn University. Professor Rubenstein is the James R. Ahrens Chair in Constitutional Law and Director of the Robert J. Dole Center for Law and Government at Washburn. He teaches and writes in the areas of administrative law, constitutional law, artificial intelligence, legislation, jurisprudence, and federal contracting. Professor Rubenstein's scholarship has been published in the Michigan Law Review, Northwestern University Law Review, UCLA Law Review, Vanderbilt Law Review, and other distinguished journals. And his work has been widely cited in law journals and several federal judicial opinions. Professor Rubenstein will be talking to us a bit about what we can learn from some recent examples, including particularly from the Anthropic and Department of Defense dispute related to corporate accountability and the role of corporations in being a moral voice, particularly in the age of AI. So I'm thrilled to let you hear from our panel, and with that, I will turn it over to Professor Family.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad you're here, and hello to all of our Zoomers out there. This exercise was really interesting for me because it kind of brought me full circle, because I practiced immigration law before I became a law professor, and I practiced what's known as business immigration law. So you might think that immigration law just by itself is its own narrow field, but even within immigration law, there's lots of different types of practices. So I think through my presentation today, you'll get a better sense of what business immigration law means. But before I get into that, I just wanted to share with you, I sort of sat down and brainstormed all the ways that business and immigration intersect. So first, and probably the most obvious, is that businesses are employers, right? And sometimes employers want to hire foreign nationals to work for their business. And that's really what business immigration lawyer does, is they try to figure out, what the business needs, and then how, if possible, to fit that need into a very intricate statutory and regulatory framework where Congress has said, these are the kinds of foreign nationals that can be employed in the United States. So that being said, that means that businesses are also customers of the government, right? Because businesses have to petition for permission to legally employ foreign nationals in the United States. And that experience of being an employer and being a customer of the government and trying to work through this crazy technical system sometimes leads businesses to become activists, right? To say, hey, I've had experience with this system. It's really not working for me as a business. I bet there are other businesses out there that have similar complaints. And so sometimes businesses will get together, even through, already existing trade groups, and they will advocate for change to the immigration laws. Businesses can also be contractors. So this means that businesses are contracting to do immigration-related work for the federal government. just as I was putting this together, I saw that Delta, the airline, has been getting some heat lately, not because of the TSA lines, but because some video emerged that they actually flew kids to immigration detention. So there were kids with ICE officers, immigration and customs officers, and they don't always transfer people to detention on a private plane. Sometimes they board regular commercial flights. So some video emerged that Delta had flown some kids to detention. Businesses can also be jailers in this context, right? Private prison companies make a lot of money off of immigration law and immigration enforcement. ICE's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, their largest contractor is the GEO Group. And perhaps not surprisingly, last year, the GEO Group reported record revenue because the government is asking their private prison contractors to detain more individuals. And just last year, Congress allocated $45 billion for immigration and customs enforcement to build new detention facilities. So there's going to be even more work for private businesses supporting that effort. Sellers, right? Businesses sell stuff to immigrants. So this presents, I think, a different perspective where, a business may be developed specifically to appeal to what an immigrant consumer wants, or it could just be that the business just exists and there are immigrant customers. Enforcer, right? Sometimes businesses are called on by the government to enforce immigration law. In fact, we could say every business is an enforcer because every business has to certify that every employee has permission to work in the United States. I'm sure you have filled out an I-9 form whenever you've started a new job, and that's businesses playing a part in the enforcement of immigration law. And universities also play a role in this with foreign students because the immigration laws force universities to check to make sure that students are complying with their student status in the United States. Businesses are neighbors, of course. I think we saw this play out in Minneapolis, and we'll probably hear more about this. Businesses are neighbors to immigrants, they're members of the community, and so that can factor in terms of how a business interacts with immigration and may push the business to become an activist or not. I think businesses also play the role of a steward, right? In that because businesses are sort of a stable customer of the government, even though, different employees may come and go, businesses play a role in sort of making sure that the immigration system is working as it should, and they also educate their employees, right? Because their foreign national employees might not have any idea what's required of the business in order to hire that particular individual. And the last one I came up with is respondent. Right? Sometimes businesses are investigated by the federal government for potential immigration violations. So sometimes a business immigration lawyer is representing a business in a defensive posture, right, against a government investigation rather than applying for benefits. Okay, so I probably have left something out, but I feel like that's a pretty comprehensive list. So with that in mind, focusing just on business immigration law, so focusing just on that role as sort of employer and customer in terms of a business wanting to hire a foreign national legally in the United States. So just to give you a sense, remember I described that sort of crazy system that an immigration attorney has to figure out and has to sort of take, the employer doesn't know this system. So the employer will come and say, I need someone to perform X job. And so the business immigration lawyer has to figure out, is there a legal slot available? Has Congress said that somebody doing that kind of job may immigrate to the United States and perform that work legally within the United States? So I'm not going to go through all of these in exhaustive detail. I just wanted to give you a sense of how complex it is and just sort of a general sense of what categories are available. So if an employer wants to hire a foreign national permanently, right, that is to get a green card, then the highest level of preference goes to these EB-1 priority workers, perhaps most adequately exemplified by workers of extraordinary ability, right? So these are people who are at the very top of their field, and they're people that Congress has decided should be able to work in the United States, no matter whether there's a shortage of US workers who could do their job, right? So think Albert Einstein, but you don't even have to be Albert Einstein. You don't have to be like the best ever, but you do need to be at the top of your field. And then we drop down to professionals. These people sadly only have exceptional ability. They don't have extraordinary ability. But again, we're looking for highly skilled individuals who have really shown that they have made a difference in their particular field. Although once we drop down to EB2, the employer is going to be required to go through the labor certification process, which is a process by which the employer tests the US labor market, and they have to show that there are no qualified US workers available to do the job. Or they can apply for something called a national interest waiver, which essentially says, normally we would require labor certification for this, but we won't because it's in the national interest. EB3 similarly is reserved for skilled workers, right? Mostly. The first time we talk about an unskilled worker, we have to drop down to that bullet that says other workers, where less than 2 years of experience is reserved for the job. So the way that Congress has set up the legal immigration opportunities is that they're really mostly reserved for highly skilled workers. If you're looking for someone where the job requires less than 2 years of experience to do the job, we've only got this teeny tiny category of other workers. As EB4 and EB5, those are also reserved for people with skills like religious workers or immigrant investors who have at least $1 million to invest in the United States. So you can see already that one of the big problems facing an employer is that if you're looking to hire someone for a unskilled position, there just really aren't any slots to put that person into. But there also are temporary categories. So these are categories where the employer isn't quite ready yet to sponsor the person for a green card, but they may have a temporary need for the individual. And by temporary, it can be several years, but it's not permanent. So we've got business visitors, we've got H-1B, which you may have heard of, but H-1B requires at least a bachelor's degree. L-1, that's an intra-company transfer. So like, if you work for a multinational corporation and currently you're working abroad and they want to transfer you to the United States. Also usually highly skilled because it's reserved for managers or people who have specialized knowledge about the business. O-1, extraordinary ability, is kind of like the green card for extraordinary ability, except this is just temporary. Treaty traders, it really isn't until we get to H2 seasonal workers that we start to look at some potential unskilled labor. Exchange visitors, and so that's kind of, you can think of as a different kind of foreign student exchange. And then the P, non-immigrant visa, is reserved for artists, athletes, and entertainers. That's how your favorite pop group, right, gets to come to the United States and perform. All right, so even assuming that an employer can find some an to put their potential employee into, then the employer has to work through an unbelievable bureaucratic maze to actually make this happen. And so the top 3 agencies are all a part of the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The bottom, we've got the Department of Justice, which runs the immigration courts. The U.S. Department of Labor, they oversee the labor certification process. And the Department of State issues visas abroad to travel to the United States. So depending on the exact category, either permanent or temporary, the employer is going to have to live through bureaucratic processes at some combination of these 6 entities. Okay, and so the last little bit of background I'm going to give you before I turn over the mic is these are the sources of immigration law. So when we think, what if you're a business immigration lawyer and an employer comes to see you and says, make this happen, this is the sources of law that you're going to be looking to try to make that happen, right? Of course, there's the U.S. Constitution sitting up top. As far as statutes, the product of Congress, we've got the Immigration and Nationality Act. We've got case law that comes from the Article 3 judicial branch. And then from the executive, we have executive orders, we have agency regulations, we have agency decisions that are the result of adjudication within the particular agency. And we have piles and piles and piles of guidance documents, which are sub-regulatory, right? So they're not notice and comment regulations. They're just memos where one of these agencies has said, here's what we think about this particular issue that isn't directly addressed in a statute or in a notice and comment regulation. So I'm sure I've convinced you all that this is a super easy and fun thing to do as an employer. So with that, I am going to turn things over.
I first want to thank Professor Feldman for inviting me. It's been a wonderful reunion. Professor Feldman has shared with me some of my absolute favorite teaching techniques I've ever received, so it's a delight to be here. And I also should acknowledge Dean Cummings. He and I go back. I've never seen anything goofy from him, ever. I do want to acknowledge that he has been very integral in my career and supporting me in a journey that has led me here today. So you're very lucky to have him. He's a wonderful mentor and has never done anything embarrassing ever in his life. My interest in immigration really has been limited to as it relates to businesses. So there was a period of time, I did have a record label, fairly inactive, but I did sponsor some artist visas. My parents are immigrants and my mother is an immigration lawyer. And so obviously, since my mother is an immigration lawyer, I never wanted to touch anything immigration related. But as Professor Family has pointed out, it touches everything, right? It is very much a part of the national identity we have and how businesses operate. And it was made particularly clear in the past couple months in the Twin Cities region. And, you know, I think it's pretty obvious. We have fewer immigrants in Minnesota than Utah, right? Than obviously Texas and Florida, right? We have significantly fewer immigrants than these red states. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Governor Walz is from Minnesota, right, who ran as a vice president. And this was very much ready and not ready moment for Minnesota. And it was strange to see, you know, kind of morbid predictions that we as law professors had come true in real life. I want to credit to a lot of the data that this PowerPoint is coming from is from a really great organization called North Star Policy Action. They are a think tank and a really solid research organization. I'm very proud to be on their advisory board, and so a lot of the data comes from there and the economists there. So the Twin Cities, you know, I don't really. Is this being recorded? If there's a Minnesotan, they'll get really mad. But the Twin Cities, they're like right next to each other. I don't even know why they're two cities because the downtowns are less than 5 miles apart. But I never said that. Okay, I never said that. The Twin Cities region has about 1 million people, and it's pretty condensed. I mean, it's pretty. They're interchangeable. We're actually in St. Paul, but it doesn't matter to me. The same. So 2,000 ICE agents were deployed, and 1,000 CBP agents were deployed, and there was use of local police in a 2-month period. This is the ICE. Even the website boasts that this is one of the largest operations that they had ever deployed. And not really clear, right? With no clear statement as to why Minnesota, right? No statement of there's been a record number of people overstaying their visa in Minnesota. Nothing was articulated that justified the scale. And so the North Star Policy Action Group did a pretty good job of looking at how much is this costing taxpayers, right? Because all of these are federal employees, these are federal taxes. So they took specific categories in trying to come up with that cost. One was direct taxpayer expenditures and looking at how much it costs from our perspective as taxpayers, and then also looked at the reduced economic activity. The details are on their website, but I do feel that they were very careful and their estimates were pretty conservative and on the lower end than what really was happening. Okay, so from a weekly cost breakdown, it was about $9 million, right, per week, just to pay for the workers for the ICE and CBP. I always do that wrong. CBP folks there. Not including the local police, and then $4.5 million in lodging and meals, and then of course the detention centers themselves cost about $1.6 million a week, and then the local police overtime, right? So there was definitely some commandeering, and there was pushback, and then eventually St. Paul Police did participate in a bunch of the activity, which was, you know, very much a problem locally, and there was a lot of. I think it costs the mayor a lot to participate in that politically. So essentially, that was costing $18 million a week, right, to be in the Twin Cities, which clearly has a lower immigrant population than at least the 3 red states, if not many, many more. And in Minnesota, 20% of the low-wage workforce is comprised of immigrant people. So there's a lot of, this was surprising to me. You know, I took the job because of academic freedom issues I was having my previous employer, right? And so I was delighted to see how diverse the Twin Cities itself was. There's a huge Somali community. There's a very large, or significantly larger than at least Arkansas, Vietnamese community. There is an Ethiopian community. There's a large Latino community. A lot of it has to do with a lot of Lutheran churches were very active in refugee relocation programs for a while now. And so it is, for me, delightfully diverse, and I get really good food options. It's fantastic. And about 1 in 4 new businesses are founded by immigrants in Minnesota, and 20% of low-wage work is, comprised of immigrant labor. So, and then of low-wage work, it's 1 in 9 jobs held by immigrants. Particular concentration in food processing and agriculture. So, Spam, I'm blanking out. In Austin, Minnesota, Hormel is based out of Austin, Minnesota, and so there's food processing operations and all over Minnesota. There's in rural Minnesota, and agriculture as well. So it is an agriculture state. It's a big dairy state. It is also a center for healthcare and medical services, and logistics and supply chain. So there's about 15 Fortune 500 companies and dozens of more large privately held businesses. Okay, about 41 billion of economic output is attributed to immigrant labor. About 1 in 7 entrepreneurs. And that is just, the 1 in 7 is in the Twin Cities region. Statewide, the largest growing segment of the rural population, the largest growth is immigrant communities. So there were weeks where every immigrant business was closed. They were just too scared, whether or not they had employees who were present lawfully or not. Businesses were closing out of sheer fear. And there was a huge revenue loss, okay? 75% of closures in commercial corridors that had strong immigrant populations were just dead. And there was also an issue of just worker absenteeism, again, through sheer fear, regardless of their status, right? In the meantime, the corporations, right, it's a headquarters, there's a big headquarters economy in the Twin Cities. 3M is based out of Minnesota. Cargill is a big Minnesota family, and they love to remind us all the time, like it's a family-owned thing that we should ignore, that 49% is foreign-owned, right? But they like to present as a Minnesota family-owned operation, right? And I thought, let's just look a little bit at how much is this really a pure free market? Right? Minnesota's very proud of being a business center, and so I just wanted to know, are you getting any subsidies, right? So in the form, right, are you getting any corporate welfare, right? I mean, I think that tax credits, abatements, tax increment financing, these are all major bipartisan supported programs, right? And they're programs that I personally helped administer in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina. It's true money, right? It is real money. It's not, it's not little droppings here and there to work on specialty public interest projects, right? These are just development subsidies. And so it's not hard, right? Because these are public funds, to see how much has gone to these corporations that really like to present themselves in their kind of homely accent as being Minnesotans, right? And they are very eager to present as being local, right? Medtronic, which is one of the huge medical device companies, I think they do a pacemaker. Yeah, they produce a pacemaker. Target, which we all know, Cargill, and Land O'Lakes, right? $1 million in public, state and local subsidies, right? So not even just federal funds, but state and local subsidies. 38 million, 6 million from Target, and 14.8 million from Cargill. 148 million from Cargill to Cargill, both federal and state funds. Right? So these are definitely corporations that are supported by public funding, right? And they were quiet. Nothing, and you know, Medtronic, Cargill certainly has a giant portion of its labor market that is comprised of H workers, as well as, you know, the workers that are in the kind of ag science part. Same with Land O'Lakes, the butter, right? It is a dairy operation, and you know, it's surprisingly farmer owned, and it is a cooperative that is filled with very imperative immigrant labor. And Medtronic has a big, I think their engineering department has a huge portion. There's also Best Buy. I had a colleague and a friend try to stop a lot of the deportation of their scientists out of Best Buy. And none of these employers spoke out, right? You'd think, even out of just pure self-interest, right, that they would, because they're really good at speaking out when they want the policy changed, right? On the counts, on the caps, on, you know, what the screening procedure is, but they were quiet. And not only were they quiet, some were complicit, and I'll talk a little bit that in a couple of slides. And there was no coordinated business response. They put the most vanilla softball op-ed in the local paper. I mean, it was a, you know, no other use for that op-ed than for tissue paper, in my opinion. It was like an impressively unimpressive op-ed. And, you know, in fact, there was a Hampton Inn in a kind of suburb of the Twin Cities in Lakeville that refused to house ICE agents. And it is owned by Hilton, and its reward for having, you know, corporate staff with like blood pumping through its heart, right? Their heart. It was removed from the Hilton brand. They were quickly removed, and so they have no more like ability to market through Hilton to have guests who use Hilton rewards. It is really seen as like a huge economic problem now for them to not be in the chain. And that was for them simply not refusing to house ICE agents. Okay, in the meantime, there's this really great Black-owned pizza place. I haven't gone to because I'm not into Detroit pizza, but now I'm like gonna go because of this. I mean, you know, it's really bready. It's like a more bready version of Chicago style. Anyhow, point being is they're really delightful owners. So now I'm gonna go, and they raised $83,000 and donated and coordinated really great food delivery to impacted families, right? A lot of people in the service industry, in the food service industry, and they did a great job. I mean, they were really, the mutual aid programming that just popped up really organically was incredibly impressive. And I think everyone saw on the news, you know, the protest and the direct action were not, I think, what the president expected, right? I mean, the optics don't look great when the protesters are like these middle-aged, like white ladies who make casseroles, right? It was not really the image that I think what he was hoping for to, you know, justify a declaration of martial law. It was really a broad set of people who were outraged and showed their outrage. And so Rectangle's reward was being raided by ICE. And attempting to enter the restaurant premises, which was ridiculous. I mean, they came in full, you know, gear, and I mean, the place is a third of the size of this room, right? And then, you know, staff were followed home from the restaurant. I mean, it was pretty terrifying. Another business, El Tapatio, it's just a little restaurant in a small town in Minnesota where ICE agents stopped to eat and then returned in the evening and detained workers who had served them earlier in the day, right? So this was not business as usual. This was clearly strange and vindictive and horrible all at the same time, right? So I think it made me think, like, to the extent to which DHS and the private sector overlap. And last summer, I was privileged enough to co-teach with a rising colleague who actually, it's delightful, he was my student. He's a German PhD student who was an LLM student at Mitchell Hamlin, and he has specialized since then in privacy, data privacy, and we co-taught a class together. And there is a lot of overlap between the US's private sector in the tech industry and our government, right? So we have an agency that specifically is a venture capitalist firm for government technology. And this venture capitalist firm, OIP for short, provides financial support specifically for surveillance technology. Okay, and it incentivizes private tech firms to create enforcement-focused solutions. So there is a very strong public-private pipeline. Even the name was super of the fund is so generic, you would not even, I forget what it is because it's so generic. Really under the radar, but it is known that it is specifically, it's a VC fund specifically for surveillance. Okay, and so DHS use a lot of this tech coming out of the private sector, right? And I think Dave is going to talk more about that and AI. One I thought that was interesting is Paragon Graphite. And so Paragon enabled DHS to operate people's phones and look through their WhatsApp. Like, so, right? So WhatsApp is supposed to be the most secure. It's user to user, end user to end user encryption. It's supposed to be the most secure, but only if the person has their phone, right? It's so the spyware enables the government to access people's phones as if it was the user. And it was an Israeli-created and owned and operated company that was sold to a U.S. company, right? And so for a long time, the U.S. would not do business with foreign-owned spyware companies because that's like a no-brainer. Now other people know the software you're using. There's a slight national security risk, right, when a whole other country is aware of the toys, right? And so with enough kind of magnifying glass, I think the U.S. thought, well, if it gets bought by a U.S. company, we're good, right? And so that's how they decided to solve that problem. But it is a problem, right? It is a problem that all this data that ICE is using is, first of all, creepy, right? Number one, and then number two, made by a country with, a pretty, let's say, complex status in the world, right? And so the Operation Metro Surge really, really highlighted the role that the private sector can and does play, for better and for worse. And yet, at that same time, corporate stakeholders, the largest ones, even the ones that are highly dependent on immigrant labor, are silent, right? We have yet to do, to have a really good study. I mean, it's still they're still here, right? They're still in Minnesota. They're like slowly leaving, but there still are ICE agents in Minnesota. There are still people who are very afraid to go to work. So it's hard to even say how much the regional economy will have been affected by this. But we do know taxpayers spent $18 million a week, at least for a 6-week period, on Operation Metro Surge. And that is all I have to say.
Good job.
Hi, everybody. Who here uses artificial intelligence? These large language models, raise your hand. Just about everybody, yeah. You know, I asked this question a couple years ago, and people are always scared because we're still not sure if it's okay to use AI in academia. Who here uses Anthropic's Claude? Anybody here within the last month delete ChatGPT from your phone and replace it with Anthropic Claude? Raise your hand. You know, the reason I'm asking is about a month ago, more than 1 million people did just that. Why? Well, have you heard about what's going on between Anthropic and Department of Defense? Yeah. So let me sort of explain and connect these dots and try to get to the bottom of how all of this applies to immigration. Before I get into the details, let me just sort of point where I'm headed with my remarks today, is that artificial intelligence really has enabled a new level or a new layer of surveillance by extracting and synthesizing large amounts of data. I mean, this is really where AI has become extremely powerful. And the government uses these technologies from private companies like Anthropic and Palantir and OpenAI and other names that you'll have heard of to supply the technological structure, the infrastructure on which ICE relies to enforce the immigration laws. And it is really a hidden layer in the immigration apparatus that few people really fully appreciate. And so I want to talk about that layer to shed some light on it, and then to think about altogether maybe what to do about it and what some of the implications are. So let me first begin with what happened. So Anthropic is a main competitor to OpenAI, ChatGPT, Google. There's a handful of the premier AI companies, and in fact, Anthropic was the only AI company to be cleared for classified uses of the technology within government and the Department of Defense in particular. So just to give you a sense, I mean, that wasn't true for Google, it wasn't true for OpenAI, but Anthropic was perceived to have either the trustworthiness and or the technological capability to be given a $200 million contract, along with sort of the prestige of being the only AI company to have access to this information. So when Anthropic contracted with the Department of Defense, Anthropic had two limitations that were built into the contract. One limitation was that Anthropic's AI system could not be used for autonomous lethal weapons. The other was that Anthropic's chatbot, or it's more than a chatbot now, but their large language model cannot be used for mass domestic surveillance of American citizens. So those were the two clauses written into the contract. And I think it's worth pausing there just to sort of appreciate what's going on here, is that you have a corporation that is insisting on contractual terms, which I think many or most Americans would agree should go without saying. But for the insistence of including those contractual terms, the federal government, the Department of Defense, presumably would be using Anthropic's and all the other AI companies' large language models for those purposes. After the raid in Venezuela and the capture of Maduro, Anthropic kind of started poking around, asking some questions and say, hey, was Claude, or which is their product, was Anthropic's large language models used in any way for the information gathering, or was there any role that the platform played in the capture of Maduro? And this really upset some people at the Pentagon, because they thought that who is Anthropic to say? Why should a corporation even have the audacity to ask how its services are being used by the federal government? So around that time, the federal government, Department of Defense, wanted to basically retroactively change the contract and replace, not just for Anthropic, but for any, because the other companies were also contracting with the military. They just didn't have the classified clearance, but all of the big companies contract with the government and the Department of Defense. And now Hegseth is insisting that all of the companies, the AI companies, have to agree basically to a new contract term, which is that the federal government or the Department of Defense in particular can use these models for quote unquote any lawful purpose. Anthropic sort of had the same question you have, which is, well, what is any lawful purpose? Because, does that mean that it is lawful for the federal government to engage in mass domestic surveillance of American citizens? Right? Because if it's not, then why would the Pentagon be insisting on being able to do that instead of the contracts that were already in place? I just want to say right now, just because of the focus of the conversation, I flagged the 2 red lines, and one is the autonomous lethal weapons, and if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer those. My focus today is going to be on the mass domestic surveillance, because this is going to tie to much more closely to the immigration. So this was interesting because basically the federal government at the end of February essentially gives Anthropic an ultimatum. It says basically you have to sign this contract, or we are not only going to end the contract with you, $200 million, which is a lot of money, but it's not what this is all about, because we know $200 million is really not all that much for these companies. It was a threat to classify Anthropic as a supply chain risk, which is a designation that has never been used for a domestic company at all. This is very rarely used for like Chinese companies, like Russian companies, the idea being that the government should not have these foreign companies, their technology, or it doesn't have to be technology, but it could be any goods, but in the supply chain as part of the government's work, because it's a national security threat. And so this is just shocking on a number of levels, including within the industry, because, right, the industry, on the one hand, is fighting off all kinds of regulation on the grounds that we need AI to compete with China, right? But at the same time, the industry has a very strong and legitimate interest in making sure that the federal government doesn't just take over these companies. I mean, if you think about how powerful these tools are today, and certainly what is projected for how powerful they might be in 5 years, I mean, if we do get artificial general intelligence of the kind that people are losing sleep about, one could, I think, reasonably ask, why should private companies be the ones controlling this? I mean, if it was nuclear power, like, we would expect that maybe the federal government would come in and nationalize the firms, just take it at some point in the future. And so all of industry, even the ones that a lot of them did sign, "Oh, fine, all lawful use, we trust you." But this is a blow to the industry, because they're walking a very difficult line right now, right? On the one hand, they want to have the government support so that AI can basically disseminate and they can recoup all their money and we can make the world a perfect place. On the other side, though, the concern is that the AI becomes so powerful and so important that the federal government just takes it over. And so this contract dispute is sort of a light onto how this could maybe play out, and people are able to extract and project going into the future. So then what is Anthropic going to do with this ultimatum? All eyes, especially if you're in this world, I wouldn't necessarily assume that everybody in this room would be, but all eyes that care about these things, which is a lot of eyes, are wanting to know what Anthropic's going to do. Because Anthropic has built a name for itself as being the quote-unquote AI safety AI lab. You know, in fact, maybe many of you probably don't know this, AI was a spin-off from OpenAI, which is ChatGPT. Some of the people in the original OpenAI project, they spun off because they were worried that OpenAI would basically sell out and give up on AI safety. And so Anthropic, in similar, I would say, to how Apple sells itself on privacy. Anthropic is the company relative to the others that prides itself and it's part of its image. And by the way, a genuinely held, very deeply genuinely held interest and concern about AI safety. And so if Anthropic is going to fold, this is not only going to say something important about the industry, but also I don't know where that leaves Anthropic. because they would have to basically sacrifice very deeply held ideological beliefs. For them, it's much more than just the contract. But at the same time, we know what the Trump administration is capable of, and that sometimes the threats come through, sometimes they don't, and maybe because of that, it's a little bit of rolling of the dice. But in this instance, the government did not back down, and neither did Anthropic. And so when the deadline came, which was a Friday evening, Anthropic said, we're not going to sign on to this all lawful purpose contractual language, and if you don't want to work with us, fine. Like, we could end the contract. But that night, or that, I think it was Friday, maybe the Thursday before, President Trump goes on social media calling Anthropic a bunch of woke, radical left, all of the culture war language that you would expect. But now the White House is involved. So to the extent that the public wasn't paying attention, they are now. And one of the things that took me sort of aback, but it's not surprising, it's almost affirming, is, and again, people feel free to disagree. And by the way, I'm centrist, for whatever that's worth. So I'm not here to give you a position, but just as an observer, I think that there's a certain amount of hubris, I think, that the White House or the government thinks that this is a fight that they want to make publicly, right? That the White House and the Department of Defense wants to take it to the public whether or not the Department of Defense could use AI for autonomous lethal weapons and mass domestic surveillance on citizens, not immigrant citizens. And the government feels strongly enough to bring this to the public. And there's lots of headlines. If you go back about a month, you'll see this was in the New York Times. It's in all the major outlets. If you missed it, it's because at the same day that the Pentagon said we have to declare Anthropic a security chain risk, we have to get Anthropic out of our systems, other federal contractors, including, let's say, the other big cloud providers like Amazon, but basically anybody doing business with Anthropic and doing business with the government might have to extricate themselves from, they may have to also break their contracts with Anthropic. So there's like a domino effect throughout the entire the procurement sort of relationship between the Department of Defense, Anthropic, and all the people that sort of contracting to use Anthropic in their services that are being provided to the Department of Defense. So basically, later that night, on Friday, the same day that the government declares Anthropic's supply chain risk, we go to war with Iran. And the government is using Anthropic's AI. So like on the one hand, the Trump administration is saying like this technology, we can't trust Anthropic, it's dangerous, it's like on par with a Chinese national security risk, but we're just gonna use it for another 6 months because we're about to attack Iran. So it's like either the technology is safe and trustworthy or it's not. But in this instance, and it won't be the first time, we have sort of conflicting messages that are coming through. Okay, so in the fallout from all of this, or while it's going on, this gets back to there's public pushback. And I think this will tie into some of the themes we're talking about, like to what extent can the market play a role? And millions of people, because of this, wanted to take Anthropic's side and show support. And one way they did that was they deleted OpenAI's ChatGPT, and now they're using Claude. So it's a message, but again, whether or not this is going to make a difference, nobody raised their hand here. So you could see like how much the market is actually going to make a difference is probably very little, other than mostly symbolic. So let me just talk about some of the what all lawful use means, because I think that it's important to bridge the gap between that contract language, what the fight is about, and mass surveillance of citizens, and then to immigration. The term mass domestic surveillance is not a defined category. It's not a legal term, right? So there's nowhere to look in the code to see like, well, what's permitted and what's not. But just to quickly get to the bottom line, there is loopholes that enable the federal government, Department of Defense, but also DHS, to engage in what I think we colloquially would call mass domestic surveillance, like putting aside any kind of legal labels. And how does this work? Well, as a legal matter, the Supreme Court held in 2018 that federal law enforcement, state, local, doesn't matter, needs to have a warrant to compel location data from cell cell phone towers and whatever. And the principle behind that was because the government was engaging in mass surveillance, essentially, by just getting this information without a warrant, and the Supreme Court said, no, you need a warrant. What the federal government has done, and this is interpret that Supreme Court holding very, very narrowly, so that now what the federal government does is it goes out and purchases all of this data on everybody in the commercial market. There's like, the data brokers. So we all know that we're being tracked by our apps. We all know that there is no national data privacy law, and all of this data is being collected by private companies, bundled up to create dossiers about everybody in this room. Mostly to sell advertisement, but it's all the same data. If they know enough about you to guess what kind of ad you might want to see, they know a lot about you, and they could use that information for anything they want, including where you might work, like who you're associating with, and all kinds of things. So the federal government is collecting all this data. What AI is enabling is basically the work of millions of data analysis, because you can now run all of this mass amounts of data through an AI system to give you very specific targeted outputs if, in fact, you're trying to target an individual, but you're collecting this on all citizens, all immigrants. It's a ton of data, and it's all being collected and run by other private companies. So you probably heard of Palantir, for example. So Palantir is sort of the platform layer where all of this data is going. You remember Doge was, collecting all this data, probably unlawfully. And all of this is getting siphoned, not only collected into one place. When you have multiple data points, you could really build a picture of somebody, being basically shared with Palantir. And Palantir runs the platforms that govern military uses, but also immigration. So it's all being run through Palantir, this private corporation. All the data is being aggregated, and it's being used in all these different ways. So to say that the government can use the Anthropic or any of these AI systems for all lawful uses, just understand the big loophole here is that all lawful uses includes buying commercial data on the private data broker market and then using that data for mass surveillance, mass immigration enforcement, or targeted immigration enforcement if the government wants to single out people or citizens for that matter. Now, a lot of people in this debate are sort of taking sides. On the one hand, Anthropic is the responsible AI company, and people are going and lining up with Anthropic for drawing these lines. And other people, and again, I think for good reason, in the abstract at least, are taking the government side, at least to some extent, because yes, it's true. I mean, why should corporations have a say in how the government performs its functions, as long as what the government is doing is quote unquote lawful? Now, I'm here to say there are no heroes here. I think that this has become sort of a false binary between which side to support. Because let's start with the government, and I probably don't have to go into much detail beyond what I've already said here. The government is, I don't think, if you believe that the federal government should not be using AI for the things that Anthropic said should not be used for, then that's probably all I really need to say about that. And probably if I told you that the Pentagon said, don't worry, we're not going to use AI for these things, you would not be satisfied. You would be worried for good reason. But let's talk about Anthropic here, because Anthropic is being pitched as sort of like the good guy. And I think it's true, but that it's relative, right? Like compared to other AI companies, whether it's Musk's Grok or OpenAI, which basically swept in to replace Anthropic on the contract, by the way, allegedly on the same terms, like there was also the same red lines, but putting that aside, that Anthropic, because it took a stand, and I think is rightfully being sort of rewarded for the stand that it took. But understand that the red lines that are being drawn are already putting us in a starting position that is arguably illegitimate and maybe immoral. If the red line is that the federal government should not be using AI for mass domestic surveillance of citizens, where is the framing for non-citizens? And if you think that there's some dignitary right or just sort of worry about government power, maybe it shouldn't matter whether someone is a citizen or not when it comes, at least from a moral perspective or a legitimacy perspective. And so the red line that Anthropic is drawing is already excluding the populations that need protection most. And so I find it hard to get behind the Anthropic full-throatedly because there is a choice, first of all, to do business with the government in the first place. And as much as I support the lines that are being drawn, we shouldn't assume that that should have been the starting point for the line drawing to begin with. Now, I would say that there are many gaps and deficits that this whole episode has brought to light, which are, I'll say, the first one is legal, right? The whole all lawful purposes contractual language, or trying to retroactively import that contractual language, is pointing legal gaps in our privacy laws, the way that the government can collect and buy data on the open market. It is showing gaps in federal procurement law, right? The fact that like, there's a lot of questions now about to whether or not industry should be able to have contractual terms that limit the government's use of their goods and services. So we have a number of legal gaps. I would say that because of the legal gaps, we have democratic gaps. Because if there is no current law in place, the question then becomes is who should decide what the rules of the road should be, what the guardrails should be when it comes to the use of this technology, whether for domestic uses on citizens and or on immigrants. And I think that even having that conversation is very important, but it's also a hard conversation to have because we have another gap, which is the sort of technological literacy. This stuff is very complicated to understand. You know, to understand like to what extent the government is relying on private companies and using loopholes in the law, you know, and having a platform that collects data and uses AI over it. And so I think it's a lot to take in for the average person who really probably wants to participate in this democratic discussion. But without laws in place, we essentially have corporations on the one side, and we have executive officials who are making decisions that are not rooted in any kind of democratically accepted norm because they're doing it on the fly. The third gap, I would say, is a trust deficit, because if the choice is, as I've just laid it out, is between big tech and the government, who do you trust? And right now, I think everybody knows that social trust is which is the trust that we have in society between each other and with institutions, as an all-time low. And sort of, it extends to universities and all sorts of things, even the press. But I would say two of the biggest trust deficits are big tech and the government, the federal government right now. And so it's like, well, how do we even fix this? And who do we turn to make this right? So I'll leave it at sort of those open questions because I think they get to some of what we'll talk about together. But thank you for your time.
Professor Rubenstein, and to all of our panelists. We're going to have a bit of a moderated Q&A, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience as well. So I guess I'll sort of start where you left off, right? And just, we've heard about corporate silence, corporate complicity, but also with the Anthropic example, a bit of an example of corporate resistance, examples of some of the small businesses in the Twin Cities as examples of corporate resistance. How much of what we've discussed today is a legal problem versus a cultural one? So specifically with addressing some of those gaps, those deficits, would better laws change behavior, or does something deeper need to shift, or is it a combination? I'll open that up to whoever would like to answer that question.
I mean, I feel that laws changing are generally the legislators feel pressured to go with what the cultural shift is doing for fear of cynical, perhaps. And so that's why I was waiting for 3M and Cargill to do something, because they're pretty good at changing immigration policy when they're right behind, like not that behind. And so it is, I have concerns just listening to David about, oh God, how long is it going to be before they make a takings argument? Property, issue. So I do think that for now, until that happens, but hopefully the DOJ didn't pay attention to property law, like many people. So I do think there is the power of corporations to not do things, right? I think there's a long history of corporate power being extremely complicit, right, in World War II and the making of gas chambers by companies that still exist today, right? So I think that, and it does impact their bottom line. I think Target has really suffered since pulling their DEI campaigns, and they really, a lot of consumers felt very betrayed by them. So I still think that they have power. I think a CEO in a modern multinational company has more power than the president. So I think it's a cultural shift. I think it'll take a while before it will be a legal problem that can be fought in the courts as a constitutional issue. But that's just me. I don't know. What do you guys think?
So one thing about courts, as much as I love them, they're very slow. So if you're looking for, an immediate response, courts probably aren't your best bet. And really the thing I most want to add to this discussion, and I understand the critiques of corporations and businesses, and this really isn't a direct rebuttal. It's just to sort of shift the conversation a little bit to ask, why do these corporations feel like they can't respond? So I want to sort of keep the main part of the blame where I think it should be, in that this administration, I think, has broken every norm of behavior that we've seen. So I think we should keep that in mind too, that somebody put these big corporations in a position where they felt like they couldn't respond.
I'll pick up there. I think we have to be thinking about corporations in general, which I think your remarks are speaking to Target and even small businesses on the one hand. And I think it's worthwhile keeping big tech sort of separate, because there's certainly a Venn diagram, there's overlap in the types of influences they could have. But what I think that people in the room just already know, because they're living and they're just reading the headlines, is sort of the marriage that has occurred between Silicon Valley and the Trump administration, which is new. It's old and it's new. I mean, Silicon Valley got its roots with working with the government back when Silicon Valley was first coming up, and then we have really sort of a libertarian, probably socially progressive, but mostly leave us alone. We're Silicon Valley, we know best, and the more you regulate us, the more problematic this is going to be. And it was sort of an arm's length, like politics and the government was for decades just leaving big tech alone, and big tech wasn't getting involved in politics. That's not the case anymore. I mean, if you just, the visuals, the theater of it, if you just look at the inauguration of Trump in his second term, and the suite is filled with all the big tech leaders, all of them, not just from Palantir and Elon Musk, all of them. So it's become very transactional. And now big tech is lobbying hard to make sure that there are no laws to regulate AI, right? So the big tech is very much enmeshed with the Trump administration and in politics more generally. And now they're funding people, the primaries are going to be coming up. So this is new. You should understand that this is new. And relatedly, part of what makes it new is a backlash to what was going on sort of in 2018, 2019, where you had the line workers at Google and at the big tech companies walking out and boycotting. So you have worker organizing, which I think we should maybe pick up on. It's interesting to see the historical trajectory. And the first, 2019, basically Google got their leadership to withdraw their bid for the very same AI and technology platforms at the heart of this dispute in some ways, which is the Palantir, the Maven project, which then turns into what it is today, and Palantir has the big contract for that. But if you rewind the clock to 2019, the whole mission of big tech was like, we are not supporting the government maybe at all, but certainly not in the military context, and that has completely changed, right? So now and maybe for good reason. Maybe we do need the big tech companies to compete geopolitically for national security and for economic prosperity. So there's no problem. I'm not here to critique the relationship. What I'm saying is that it's not just through the contracts giving a helping hand. It is steering politics through super PACs now to make sure that people that would want to regulate the technology companies are not able to. And a lot of this is a blowback, it's a pushback in the same way we see the pushback to progressive and wokeism and pick your label. Basically, you're getting pushback from Silicon Valley leadership who don't want to hear from their line employees anymore. Like they want to be unconstrained not only by law, but also for the people who work within these companies who maybe have a different moral vision than the leaders do. So I think understanding that context, it may be helpful.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, but I do think that this is an old theme because, for instance, in the beef industry and all our proteins, we had very active corporations get rid of or basically dismantle the antitrust enforcement agencies so that 4 companies now handle all our beef processing, right? 5 companies sell all the seeds to our farmers. And that was not by accident. That was by dismantling the DOJ segments that were responsible for antitrust. So I think corporations have always had a very entrenched relationship with government. It's just a different flavor with the tech guys. They're younger, they're easier to be annoyed by looking at them, right? Like, Mark Zuckerberg in his little booster seat, right, in front of Congress. Like, it's a different kind of culture of dislike of corporations. But, sure, the president of Cargill might go to congressional hearings like wearing Carhartts or something, but it's the same level of power. It's just a different political flavor, I think. In ag, they never try and act woke. They try and act wholesome and folksy, but they're just as kind of prioritizing short-termism and shareholder priorities as much as the tech companies. So I do think that we have kind of examples from history to see the rise of corporate monoliths really take over a market. And we have to pay attention to all the things that you're talking about and all the laws that you're talking about, Jill. I think you're right. I just don't really see corporations. I think we have a problem with government right now. I think there are basic rule of law issues that are being litigated, sometimes successfully, but mostly unsuccessfully. But I'm never going to see a corporate CEO as a victim. It will be a hard... maybe I'll need a lobotomy to see that in a corporate CEO. They're so powerful, and for them to not just be silent, but be complicit, right, with Delta. I mean, there's a certain flavor there that is very reminiscent of, I think, the past.
One other just comment about, more directly, I think, to your question about can the law help here. I think it can. I think it well, it depends on what you think the outcome should be. But the only point I want to make is that there's not going to be a silver bullet here. That I think it's an yes and. But I think we need to reshift our cultural outlook. And the law serves a function, and I think in a law school, obviously, we see everything through the lens of the law. But the law is one device among many to steer how society is organized. And I think that there are always going to be limits in what the law itself could ever do, even under the best of circumstances.
I agree. And I'll just add, I mean, one thing that lawyers are good at, though, is becoming experts in various very technical areas. And we're really going to need lawyers to become AI experts, because someone's going to have to explain to policymakers what exactly this all is and how to regulate it. Because I don't think most legislators and policymakers have even the first clue how to get started doing that.
I want to pick up on that and just get thoughts from you and from others on the panel on that topic, right? We are in a law school. We're before a law school audience. We have lawyers, we have law students in the room. So in addition to or beyond, learning these skills that were specifically related to AI, what else is in your eyes, are the specific responsibilities that lawyers, that law students, folks who may be going into corporate practice, maybe going into government practice, what is their responsibility to use their skills? How do we as lawyers rise to the challenges that we've discussed today?
So I think one really basic thing is to just go back to the basics and explain what the rule of law is and why it's so important. Because I think most people, for example, hear the Anthropic story and can think, oh, that doesn't sit comfortably with me. But really just explaining, what the rule of law is, why it's so important, and, why government shouldn't be threatening private individuals or corporations, into doing things that they don't want to do, and why the law should apply equally to everybody, and why no one should be above the law, and why the law should be transparent. I think, sadly, that's something we need. We can't just assume that everyone understands.
I think it's an excellent question. And I think the only way that I feel comfortable answering it is to break it into categories. If you think about what is the role of a lawyer in society, we could pull from the model rules or just more generally, it's multifaceted. Lawyers have obligations to zealously represent their clients within the bounds of the law. Lawyers are officers of the court. Lawyers are community leaders. Lawyers are lobbyists. They're trying to get law, whether it's for corporations or whatever side they're on. So I think it's important to start with the notion that the lawyers, if you're representing a client, your job is to zealously represent your client within the bounds of the law. That qualifier is important, but it really is the limit. It's also like it's a duty to sort of make sure that you as the lawyer are not enabling activity because you're helping your client, let's say, violate the law. But at the same time, if you work for, let's say, Anthropic, or you work for OpenAI, or you work for the government, doesn't matter. Your client is the interest that you have to serve. So if you have a discomfort in promoting corporate interests, then maybe don't become a corporate lawyer in this context, because that's your job. Or maybe you do that, but I don't know if your client would allow you to, and this is like, you could put a different hat on, because I would say as a lawyer, you could go into public service, right? You could work for the government and hopefully not get fired and get an email to have a bullet point list of what you did last week, but you could work for the government and make a difference from the inside. You could be educating policymakers or even just people in your community. I do a little bit of all of this, because actually I don't work for clients. But there's so many different things that you could do as lawyers, and I think it's important to figure out what it is that you believe in, what is going to bring you happiness and satisfaction in your career, and then pursue those ends to the best of your ability.
I also want to add plaintiffs' firms, right? There's a case that just came out of New Mexico that's incredibly significant that actually hit Meta, right? And the fact of the matter is, there's one thing my students know more than me, which is social media, right? And tech. And to your point, it's really technical. And I mean, let's face it, the gray hairs, we don't have the intuition, right? Like when I teach at we have a huge blended program. And invariably, I'm like, okay, someone needs to help me. I don't know why this sharing is not working. And I look to the youngest person in the room, and they'll come up and they'll humiliate me by pressing 2 buttons. And it's fixed, right? And the fact of the matter is, it is the next generation that is going to be able to take down big tech because they get it better. And, for me, I have students who have like a deep remorse over accepting a corporate job. And I say, do it for 2 years and then work on the other side after that, right? Like go, right? Because they have financial, they don't come from families of means where it really is a necessity to take these jobs. They have kids. I'm not, I don't really find it necessary to be like, look, these are moral jobs, these are not moral jobs, right? It's like life is a journey, right? And take the job, and there's opportunities to use that insider knowledge in a way that is consistent with what you believe in. Continue to engage in what's going on with tech. I can't, right? Like it hurts my brain, right? Like I'm like, I don't know how to make this thing work. I don't understand what the difference is between a story and a post, right? My nieces and nephews are laughing, but really those things that feel comical to us on the panel they make a difference, and that's what the whole the lawsuit of pointing out how these tools are addictive and were created algorithmically to be addictive. That's where the change is going to happen, is through that intuitive knowledge, and it's going to come from younger people, frankly, which is okay. I contribute in other ways, but that's just not going to be one of them, right? And understanding the algorithm, understanding how it affects people. It will be the younger generation of lawyers who.
I'm going to ask one final question before I turn it over to our audience, and that is just to tie this back to the title of our panel. Our panel is about reframing immigration, right? So after everything that we've heard today, what is the dominant frame around immigration that you think is you most want to challenge, or you want to talk about before we wrap it up, and what would you replace it with?
I'll start. So the framing that I would like to change is this idea that immigration is somehow a threat. To me, it's a resource and a benefit and a chance to help the world and to help individuals. And I think especially since September 11th, the framing has been that we need to protect ourselves against immigration, and I've just never seen it that way. And, all the experiences that I've had with immigration law tell me that it's something that should be embraced rather than feared.
I don't know if it is about reframing as much as seeing the Twin Cities and Minnesota communities come together in ways I didn't expect. Was deeply wonderful for me, to be honest with you. It was a unity I did not expect, and it was clear that I didn't expect, again, seeing immigration as a resource in the state rather than a threat. And I would just encourage other people in other states to realize that there's an opportunity for community to come out of this in a way that doesn't dehumanize us as people. And that was, there were moments where I was, carrying my passport and feeling like, gosh, did I make a mistake moving up here? and the reaction of people I'd never met in really meaningful ways was really heartening. And I hope that people can see and get something out of what happened in Minnesota.
Yes, my comments sort of follow on those. I don't really have an answer to. I don't have an opinion about how to reframe, all of immigration law. I mean, it's so complex and such a history. But I would say that for those who, and I would, many in the room obviously, and also on this panel for sure, for those who think that within our current immigration apparatus, there's also the how, not just like what the lines are in the laws are, but how it's being enforced, the humanity behind it or the lack thereof. For those who would like that to change, one of the things that we've witnessed in Minnesota, especially, but anywhere that people care to look, is coalition building. It's not enough for immigrants to have to stand up by themselves, for themselves. In fact, they have incentives to hide at home. And like all major social movements in the past, you need coalition building. One of the things that I believe the Anthropic debate has done, probably not as planned by the federal government, is it's sort of giving another point of entry into the overlap, the thin line that exists between immigrants and citizens. Because this surveillance of immigrants has been going on for a long time. And what's interesting is that this follows a common thread when technologies are used, whether at war or often against immigrants, it migrates, and all of a sudden we see it at home. There's something called mission creep. And so what's happening now is, again, the same technologies that have been used against immigrants now with the boost of these AI models, is if it's being turned against citizens and that messaging is made clear, that could be the basis of a coalition to sort of pick up on the momentum that's happening in cities like we're seeing right now.
Thank you all. Do we have any questions from the audience? There we go.
Oof.
Thank you, Dean Cummings.
The ringer's going to speak. No.
Laypersons are hearing is that ICE is out of Minneapolis, that the administration has dialed back their deployments, and I think I heard you say that wasn't true. So, I guess I'm asking you to sort of share exactly what's currently happening, and are ICE deployments going to be happening in other major blue cities around the country between now and the election?
The presence of ICE has definitely decreased in the Twin Cities. They're just not as visible, but they still are conducting raids. But what's interesting is not high number raids. Small operations, small businesses, and pulling 2 or 3 people out. To the extent that that will keep going on, it's hard to say. Possibly because it's less effective, right? There has been a lot of, like I pointed out, and the news has been pretty good about showing what normal everyday Minnesotans are doing to draw attention when ICE officers are around and making sure people are being moved from kind of higher risk places when ICE is around. So it was a bad idea strategically in the first place. So who knows what is there going to be a Gnome 2.0, right? Is there going to be a Bovino 2.0? It's hard to say. It is dying down. And I think that one thing that seems consistent about the administration is optics are really important. So the optics did not land well in Minnesota. So it's hard to say, right? I have no crystal ball, but there's a No Kings protest on Saturday, and it's a bizarrely star-studded cast of like celebrities that are going to show up, and that's a pretty risky um, event to do their usual thing. I think Willie Nelson, which I like forgot he was alive, is going to show up, right? Like it's like a lot of people are showing up that are bringing attention to what's happening. And I do think that the systems that were created, the mutual care systems that were created, are easily duplicable, right, in other cities. And Minnesotans have been very vocal in sharing that kind of organizing information. So you can say.
Thank you. I want to thank the panel and also our previous panel. All of it has been very interesting, and I've sort of tried to take notes throughout the course of the day, and I've noted a common theme. And the common theme is fundamentally one of trying to avoid fear. We talked this morning early on about redlining and about the fear issues that are associated with that. We've talked about immigration and the fear issues that are associated with immigration and the nature of a problem that occurs when people don't know what is the next step and they're fearful of the future. We talked about, back in the early 20th century, we talked about the Greenwood problem, which was horrific, and that was as a result of fear and trembling and rage and riots and bad things, and then it was doubled down by the problem of the insurance companies refusing to recognize appropriate damages under the coverage, so that there was a double whammy to the people who were injured by that. We've been talking here about the nature of the legal problems and the cultural problems that are associated with each one of these things, the domestic surveillances. And I think what I want to say is, if we want to address these issues with our students and our faculty and our lawyers, if we want to address these things, we have to demonstrate that our students must come out of this institution and our alumni must demonstrate in their practices that we are fearless and that we are confident in connection with our word that we offer in our advocacy, that it's ethical, it was referenced earlier in the panel, that it is correct. Obviously, there are disputes that occur among reasonable people. So one person's going to take one point of view, but another person's going to take another point of view. But that doesn't matter, because our whole country in the last 250 years has been based upon, actually beyond that, has been based upon a collective notion that if we address the issues on a high level without violence, we can come to terms with some of the problems that we have. Each one of these problems we've talked about today are problems dealing with corporate responsibility and individual responsibility and immigration responsibility. And what I want to say is, our students here have a duty to emerge from this institution, not only with a degree, but with confidence, that when they speak with clarity, not ambiguity, but with clarity, and state their position such that they can feel as though they can persuade whoever it is they're talking to. And I don't want this just to be perceived today as a series of problems, all of which we're trying to address and grapple with in our own individual way. I want there to be a common theme of confidence and fearlessness in order to be able to take steps forward. That's all.
A response from the panel on that point?
I agree.
I agree 100%. I guess on that point, any other thoughts about, we're all law professors here, right? What are we doing? What can we do? Does anything need to change about what we're doing to ensure that we are training fearless leaders? How are we doing that through our work?
I think it's always important to do what good law professors do, which is support critical thinking. And especially when that means questioning your government. I think that's what makes this country great, right? We have one of the strongest free speech governments, and to be critical when that's getting eroded. And I think our teaching should continue to remind our students of that, and also pull history, right? We teach case law for a reason. We teach old case law for a reason, and remind students exactly what my colleague at here has said, which is there is a role for lawyers, and it is important that we have good lawyers who are moral and have strong moral compass. And I think good professors do that, aren't afraid to do that. Hopefully we have the support of the institution to do that.
One thing that I think a lot of schools are beginning to do, I teach a course called AI and the Law. It's not, we do a unit on the use of AI by lawyers, but it's mostly just AI policy and the lack thereof. I think that law schools increasingly are going to have to double down on offering courses on some of these technological issues, whether it's artificial intelligence, data collection, data privacy, and all those things, because if we don't teach our students this and give them the confidence to know that lawyers have an important role to play here, then we're turning over the decision makers to people in Silicon Valley. This is some of the messaging I have. And no less than the fact that folks in Silicon Valley, and I use that, obviously it's not just Silicon Valley, you have technologists all over the place. I mean, if they get a say as to what our laws should be, then I think lawyers should have a say in what the technology should be. But the only way to do that is to educate the students. And to your earlier point, which I fully agree with, but then I want to have a sort of caveat, which I think is an important one, is that the younger generation knows how to use technology. They know how to fix the thing and scroll, but they don't know how it works. They don't know how it works. Many of them grew up thinking privacy is dead, and I think that narrative is starting to reverse itself. So it's one thing to know how to use the technology, but if you don't know what's going on under the layers of abstraction, because the reason why technology has become so frictionless is because now you just tap and scroll and push, but what's going on underneath it all? And that's the part that you need to understand in order to make laws about it, and in order to advise clients, no matter which side of the debate or which side of the V that your client happens to be on. So I think we could do a better job, and we'll need to do a better job at law schools with doing that.
And hopefully we'll still have systems engineers that will even understand that, and it won't just be AI doing that work. But I digress.
I know, right?
Just one sort of super practical thing is that I think we can teach the rule of law more explicitly than we have been in the past. I've started doing this in some of my classes, like go back to Magna Carta. I mean, I'm no longer assuming that anyone just sort of inherently knows or gets why some of these issues are so important, or how to think about them, or why for thousands of years people have fought to have certain rights, and that this isn't purely an American experiment. And yeah, I mean, I think also just coming to law school and meeting different kinds of people who, aren't exactly like you, who grew up in different situations, I think helps extinguish some of that fear as well.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions from the audience? If not, I'll ask just as a final question. We're about out of time, but I would just like to give each of you a few minutes just to leave the audience with one thing. What's the most important takeaway you want to leave with the audience? Call to action, or one question you want people to keep thinking about after they leave here today?
Yeah, I guess I could, it's obviously an important question, so I'm trying to.
Don't screw it up.
Yeah.
Good answer.
I think that if there's one takeaway from my talk today and how I'm thinking about all of this, focuses on the question of who decides what the norms and policies and laws of our society should be. And one thing to appreciate within that is that in the gaps where there are gaps in the law, it is the answers to those types of questions about what the norms and the policies, the culture should be, is being answered by someone. I mean, there is a vacuum in the law that's being filled with decisions being made by someone. And the question is, well, who is that someone, or those people, those institutions, and who should they be? And I think the first step is to just recognize, to have some awareness of the role that corporations are having, not just like very much integrated into the infrastructure of government, because the government itself does not have the know-how, does not have the technology. And so what we see on the surface, and in fact what we teach in law school, are we focus on the institutions, and we even focus even on corporations to some extent. But once it reaches the technological level of the platform, it disappears. And so much of our daily lives, not just in immigration, but like in everything, all kinds of benefits programs, and increasingly this will be the case, is going to be decided at the technological platform level. And so just to shine a light on that, and to realize that when we're looking for ways to improve the law, we have to be looking at ways to regulate the relationship between the government and corporations through the procurement channel at the technological level, especially when technological products are being sold to the government.
Student or Professor Family, final remarks.
I think I just like to remind, I think I had a lot of law students who were very frustrated about what was happening and wanted to drop out. And I think it's important to remember that actually community still matters. And even when the government had these very powerful tools, it took community and lawyers in community to understand what was happening and how to protect people you care about. So it's easy to get frustrated, but I think it is really important to remember that the role of lawyers still matters, even where rule of law is being abused, and that you'll find your role, and it is part of community, where there are humans, not algorithms.
Yeah, and I would just add, I wish more people would recognize that fear is a political tool. And so, I see this a lot in immigration. It's a wedge issue for people who know the term, which is basically just the idea is you take two groups who naturally would be affiliated, who share interests, and you split them apart by introducing another issue. So immigration also often, I think, plays that role as a political tool. So just, if you feel fearful of something, just sort of stop and ask, why am I afraid? And is there someone with a larger purpose trying to make me afraid of something?
Like that brings us back to our theme of fearlessness, right? Which I think is a great point too in this discussion. I also really appreciate our panelists for, we've been talking about corporate actors, we've been talking about legal frameworks, but also remembering the humans, right, behind these issues, behind the discussion. These are, humanizing the issues, making sure we're talking about community, right, as part of the solution to some of the deep challenges that we've talked about today, knowing that these are our neighbors, these are real people who are facing deportation, who are facing separation from their family, who are facing detention, and knowing that I think part of the strategy is division, like Professor Family. It's about fear is a tactic, right?
And so part of this panel, I think a big takeaway that I really appreciate is we're bringing it back to, will we overcome that through connection, through collective action, through community? So I want to thank you all for your discussion today and for participating in this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Just to share, just to close us out, I want to thank everyone for coming today. I am so thrilled that I have had the honor and the opportunity to participate in our 19th annual Dean's Diversity Forum. And this has been such an important discussion. I'm glad we had such a good turnout in both throughout the day, in person and on Zoom. And this is an important topic, right? When we set out, I'm grateful to be a co-director of the center with Dean Cummings and with Professor McGee, and grateful to work with our wonderful fellows. But when we set out to frame this forum around the theme of corporate responsibility now, right? It's an ambitious vision, right? And these are big topics that we were talking about, to asking what corporate responsibility looks like when we take seriously the topics of repairing historical wrongs and reframing immigration. And I'm so thrilled that our panelists this morning and this afternoon have really helped us tackle these big topics and helped us address them fearlessly, right, and confidently, and hopefully given us the tools to move forward and have those conversations with our neighbors, with our communities, and using the power and responsibility we have as lawyers to make a difference. I'm really grateful for our speakers both this morning and this afternoon, right? And our first panel with Professor Martin, with Professor Johnson and Dean Cummings challenged us to grapple honestly with the theme of repairing historical wrongs. Looking through the lens of historical redlining, right, with Professor Johnson, moving into talking about what happened with Black Wall Street, right, with Dean Cummings, talking about the framing of CSR versus business human rights with Professor Martin. And I think we've gotten to talk today about, that really set the tone for everything that followed, and rooted us in our history and as well as in the lives of the real people who have borne the cost of corporate complicity at times in wrongdoing, but also we've seen examples of how corporations can help us do better, right? And how the frame of business human rights can help us move forward in the future and do better. And our panel this afternoon built on that framework, right? Reframing immigration let us talk more about corporate responsibility through the lens of immigration law, and seeing that immigration is not a separate issue from historical injustice, right? It's sort of a continuation of the same story. Who belongs, who is protected, who bears the costs of silence and corporate complicity, and who has the power to speak. And across both of our panels, I really appreciate our speakers, right, for really giving us an important program and giving us more than that, a framework for thinking about power, accountability, silence and voice, right, and the roles that corporations and lawyers and legal institutions can play in this discussion. So to bring it back to our diversity forum and the work that our Center for Equity and Justice has done, for 19 years, this forum has brought together so many speakers to help us have urgent conversations, sometimes difficult conversations, but important conversations. And this really is a reflection of Widener Law Commonwealth's commitment to being a community where individuals from diverse backgrounds come together to learn and to grow and to lead fearlessly. And that commitment is not just visible in this room and on Zoom today, but really in the ongoing work of our Center for Equity and Justice. I'm so just incredibly honored to work with Professor McGee, with Dean Cummings, and our incredibly talented fellows. We have, I see just one of them in the room today, so we have Gabe Kuhn with us in the room today. Really appreciate you, Gabe, for being here, for helping us. And also want to name specifically our other fellows as well, David Duggan, Haley Nelson, and Eli Ziegler. You should know that this program would not have been possible without them, so I just want to take a moment to specifically thank our fellows. As you heard from David Duggan earlier today, the center is dedicated to promoting social justice and creating opportunities for historically marginalized communities and the legal profession and beyond. You heard David talk about our Pathway program that is opening the doors to legal careers for students who might otherwise not have had access, might otherwise not have had the opportunity to learn how to take and how to succeed on the LSAT. In conjunction with that, also you heard about our Guided Journey Plus program reaching aspiring law students throughout the country, right? First-generation students, students from historically marginalized backgrounds, and not just helping them improve their test scores, but also, again, building their confidence and helping them see that they belong. They belong in law school, they belong in the legal profession, and the legal profession needs them. We need those diverse voices. We need varieties of experiences that we can learn from each other. Again, I want to express my deep gratitude to our fellows and to today's panelists, Professors Martin, Professor Johnson, Dean Cummings this morning, Professor Family, Professor Rubenstein, and Professor Vuden this afternoon, for their generosity, their expertise, and their willingness to model exactly the kind of candor that this moment warrants. And again, thanking our students who are, I feel so grateful to work with them. They are the future of our profession. You've sort of heard that from this panel, right? But especially our student fellows, they are doing incredible work. And I'm so excited to see where their careers take them. I think our profession is incredibly lucky, and I'm looking forward to see the incredibly bright futures for these students. One last thing I'd like to note is April is Celebrate Diversity Month. So we are coming up on several exciting events that you heard from Dean Cummings. One of the events that we have coming up, if you don't mind handing me this flyer, is on April 8th, we are doing, there's a handout for those who haven't seen it. We will have a belonging fair. So for the students in the room or students here by Zoom, I hope you take advantage of this opportunity to join us. This is April 8th from 11 to 3 p.m., as well as from 5 to 6 p.m. in the pit. We'll have several student organizations participating in that event, and we want to hear from you about what belonging and what community means to you here at Widener Law Commonwealth. So please mark your calendars for that, in addition to the other events that Dean Cummings mentioned today. Thank you all for being here. And we hope to see you in future events as well, and hope you will keep the conversation going. Thank you so much.